Chapter 1. Cass. I couldn't believe this was now my life. Stavrock and Lucy were out tonight, again, negotiating a new trade agreement near the border between our kingdom and the human world. They were always off doing important things. Things that would improve the lives of our people. And I was left here, holding the babies. Literally. I loved my nephew and his sisters more than anything in the world, but on days like this, I longed to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. The urge to explore new horizons was becoming almost overwhelming. I clenched my jaw and tightened my hands into fists as I strode along the corridor, a walk I could do with my eyes shut. I knew every inch of this palace back to front. The castle had been my home since I was a little girl. When my parents died, my cousin Stavrock had taken me in and raised me like his own. He'd been young then, barely a year on the throne, and yet he hadn't turned me away when I needed him. He'd always treated me like the little sister he never had, far more than simply a cousin. He was part big brother, part father to me. I was lucky to have Stavrock in my life, but lately the walls and ceilings of the castle had begun to press in on me from all sides. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. No matter how far I explored, or which paths I took, I always ended up exactly where I started. That was probably because I wasn't allowed outside the castle walls, had never been really. At first I'd been deemed too young to leave, but then Stavrock's rule had become even tighter since that fateful day 3 years ago when Lucy had been kidnapped and I'd been hurt in the process. Stavrock had really locked things down after that. I understood why he kept us close. He wanted to keep those he loved safe. But I was turning 21 tomorrow, for crying out loud. I was a woman now. My own person, with my own destiny. I wanted more. I wanted adventure. I needed to know what was out there, beyond our green fields and sleepy village. Most of all, in the heart of my secret desires, I craved one thing. To go north. To visit the Kingdom of Winter. Since Stavrock had visited the north and helped Eric save the North Kingdom, I'd wanted to go myself. See the town that no one else had seen. Meet the people no one had known about, until now. I spent most days now tucked away in the castle library, trying to find out more about the town everyone had thought was just a myth. I read about ice storms and ravenous wolves, harsh winters that lasted for years on end, and huge, powerful dragons that breathed ice instead of fire. I wanted to see everything I read about in the books, for myself. I walked across the room to a large window and glared out. The view was beautiful, as always, but it was as familiar as the nose on my face. The snow-peaked mountains, the rolling hills, it seemed very tame in comparison to the harsh wilds I'd been reading about. An urge struck me to fling open the windows and release my dragon. I wanted to stretch my wings and soar. My dragon stirred inside me, and the call for adventure sang through my veins. I inhaled sharply, trying to push away the desire. Then I turned away from the view. Stavrock forbade me from leaving the castle without an armed guard. As a princess of his realm, I could be a valuable hostage. Journeying alone was risky. If somebody recognized me, I would make a worthy bride for any upstart warlord or ambitious noble who dared to challenge the king. I hated being stuck here, no more than a pawn in the games played by dragon kings and their lords. I wanted to carve out my own destiny. And yet, as Stavrock's cousin, I wasn't sure how I was ever going to do that. That evening, Stavrock and Lucy returned to the castle. I smiled with relief when they walked into the dining room, still shaking the last of the snow from their hair. The table was already laid with silver candlesticks, and the maids had decorated the white cloth with sweet floral arrangements. platters of meat and warm, soft bread were waiting for them. I stood up from the chair where I rested by the fire and rushed toward them. Lucy greeted me with a hug. She was still cold from being outside, and I shivered in my light evening clothes, pressing my hands to her pink cheeks. "You're so cold," I said, trying to warm her. As a human, Lucy wasn't as adaptable to our climate as dragon shifters. "How were my little ones?" Lucy clasped my hands, still shivering as she held my warm palms to her cheeks a moment longer. I laughed. "They were good as gold. Well, the girls were." Stavrock let out a booming laugh as he took his seat at the head of the table. "My son has a strong will, even now. He will make a fine Dragon King one day." Lucy chuckled and moved from the fireplace to take a seat beside her husband. I did the same, and Lucy reached out to brush her hand over mine as we all sat down to dinner. "Thanks for watching them, Cass. I know I can always count on you. You're an angel." I forced out a laugh. "Any time, Lucy." What else did I have to do? I fiddled with my fork. "You know I'll always be here." Always and forever. Until I die of old age in my library tower surrounded by my books, dreaming of adventures I never undertook. There were worse fates, and yet I couldn't help but want more. Some note of frustration must have come through in my voice, because when I looked up, Stavrock had set down the turkey leg he'd been gnawing on and was watching me with a contemplative expression. I tilted my head. "What's up, cuz?" A grin slid over his face, and his eyes twinkled. "Cass. Dear Cass." Uh-oh. What have I done now? "It's your 21st birthday tomorrow," Stavrock continued, and my stomach, which had lurched at his initial words, relaxed. A matching grin sparked over Lucy's face, and the two of them turned to me. My heart started to race. "You're not the child I met anymore, all those years ago." He reached out and took my hand. "You've grown into a smart, strong, and beautiful woman. I'm proud of you." My eyes widened in alarm. "Don't go getting all emotional on me, Stavrock." Still, I couldn't help but be a tiny bit pleased. If Stavrock finally saw me as an adult, then that could mean... "I think what my husband is trying to say," Lucy interjected, "is that you deserve a treat. A birthday present that will let you spread your wings, so to speak." Spread my wings? Like, actually spread my wings? Excitement burst through me, but I tried to hold it in. What if I had misinterpreted what Lucy meant? What if... "I'm taking you with me to the north," Stavrock said. I gasped, both hands lifting to cover my mouth. Stavrock grinned, obviously relishing the look of total shock on my face. "To meet the Dragon of Winter himself." My hands dropped down and my mouth gaped open. The two of them sat there looking pleased as they watched me process the news. "Oh, my God!" I squealed, launching myself out of my chair and forward to throw my arms around my cousin's neck. As Stavrock spluttered, struggling to free himself from the embrace, Lucy sat back and laughed. Stavrock patted me a few too many times, and I dragged myself back to my seat, barely able to sit still. Finally, I was getting out of this kingdom. And not just going anywhere. He was going to take me to the one place I wanted to see most. "I take it this means you're on board with your present," Lucy said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "Of course I am! I can't believe it." I leant back in my seat. 1,000 questions sprang to mind. I didn't know where to begin. "You're being serious, right? You wouldn't trick me with something like this?" I glanced between my cousin and his wife, both of whom just laughed and shook their heads. I clapped, too excited to eat any more. When do we leave? What do I pack? Is it really as cold as they say? Will there be wolves? Whoa! Stavrock reached out and put a cautionary hand on my shoulder, but his eyes expressed fondness. How about we finish this meal first? Then we can talk about the rest. Of course. Thank you, guys. This is seriously... I couldn't settle on the right word. Eventually, I just went with, amazing. Stavrock and Lucy turned back to their meals. The conversation shifted to their 3 kids, so I drifted off. I ate mechanically without tasting another bite. I wanted to race off to the library at once and bury myself in the old books I had loved since I was little, the tales of the northern explorers, battling against icy storms and fearsome beasts. I wanted to reacquaint myself with all the stories so I could prepare for actually going there in person. I'd never met Damon, the King of Winter, despite the few times he'd come to the castle for royal errands. Stavrock had always kept him and many of the other kings away from me for some reason I hadn't yet worked out. I'd only heard stories about Damon, and they were enough to pique my interest to a mountainous level. The servants passed rumours, and I'd gotten snatches of tales traded from person to person, 3rd or 4th hand, from Stavrock's expeditions and hunting parties. Everyone knew that the north was a wild place, inhabited by unruly people. Things were different there. Survival was harsher. People fought tooth and nail for everything they had. Their king, according to the rumours, was the wildest one of all. He was said to be a ferocious fighter with piercing eyes and a cold, stoic demeanour. A lifetime spent in the frozen wilderness had rendered him more dragon than man. An image formed in my mind, a dark, shadowy figure at the centre of a snowstorm. I shivered, and not just from the imagined cold. "When do we leave?" I managed at last. Stavrock looked up from his plate of food. "Tomorrow." We would leave tomorrow. On my actual birthday. I breathed deeply, trying to contain the excited squeal that wanted to rise. Best birthday present ever. My fate was in the north, that much I knew. The why? That was still a mystery. Chapter 2. Cass. When I woke the next day, the day we were set to travel, sunlight was already filtering through the curtains and warming my face. I lay there, revelling in the joy and excitement that flooded through me. It had been so long since I'd travelled, and I didn't even care that Stavrock would be babysitting me the whole time. It was a clear, bright day. I was itching to set out on our journey. I bounced out of bed, flinging the windows wide open, and inhaled the cool springtime air. "Someone's ready for their big day," a dry, amused voice said from behind me. "Little Cass, 21 years old. You're making me feel my age, child." I turned around and grinned at Maddie. She was our head housekeeper, except she was so much more than that. She was part nanny, part adoptive mother. She'd raised me as much as Stavrock had. Probably more. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips. She shook her head at me before moving over to sort out the bedsheets. I crossed the room and hugged her from behind, making her huff with disapproval at my lack of appropriateness. "You don't look a day over 20, Maddie." "Flattery will get you nowhere, young lady." Maddie smacked my hands until I backed off, but her eyes were dancing. I was her favourite, and we both knew it. "Now, a little birdie told me about your trip. I take it we've got some packing to do." I groaned. Packing and choosing clothes was the last thing I wanted to focus on right now. But Maddie merely tutted at me, opened my huge closet, and ran her hand along the rows of fabrics. She began pulling everything out and placing each item on the bed, shaking her head as she went. it soon became clear that I wasn't exactly prepared for a trip to the far north. My clothes aren't, anyway. I was used to the warmth of the castle. If I ventured outside, it was never further than the edge of town. My wardrobe was made up mostly of silk gowns and soft slippers. I found a couple of sweaters tucked at the back, but that was all I had that would save me from freezing to death. I headed down to the great hall, only to find Stavrock already there, pacing up and down. Which was odd. He was obviously in a strange mood because, instead of wishing me a happy birthday, he gave me an unreadable look, like he was agitated about something. Ugh, forget about him. This is the day everything changes. "Come this way," Stavrock said, and I let him drag me into the next room. Lucy and the babies were waiting for me there in the sunroom, along with a luscious birthday breakfast. I shoved aside whatever Stavrock's problem was because I would figure it out later. Lucy gave me a broad smile. "I had a surprise for you," she said as she jiggled the toddler on her hip. "But I'm afraid Anselm ate half of it already." On the low table, a stack of pancakes lay in the centre of a plate, surrounded by strawberries. I squinted at the writing on the top. It was clearly meant to read, "Happy Birthday, Cass," but the top layer had chunks missing. It now read, "Hap Bur A Ca." I eyed Anselm with suspicion. He blinked back at me, his eyes wide and innocent. "I love it." I smiled, then stuck out my tongue at him while Lucy was distracted by the other two. He giggled and blew a raspberry back at me. "Happy birthday, Cass." Lucy set Anselm down on the floor, then leaned forward to give me a big hug. Anselm toddled over to where his sisters were stacking wooden bricks. Now that they were all walking, it was impossible to keep them in one place. "Are you excited?" Lucy asked. "Finally, a chance to get out of here," I said, trying to sound like I meant it as a joke, but her eyes softened in understanding. "You deserve it." I pulled her aside for a moment. "Did something happen this morning?" She looked puzzled. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Why?" I shook off the uncomfortable feeling about Stavrock's mood, pasting a smile back onto my face. "I'm sure it's nothing." Ugh, forget about Stavrock. This was my birthday, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. "Anything I can help you with?" Lucy asked. "Do you need to borrow a beanie or a muff or anything?" "I do, actually. I have nothing suitable for travelling to the north. I'm too used to being here in the cosy warmth of the castle." Lucy giggled. "And I'm used to being cold all the time. My clothes might be a little big for you, but I'm sure we can get the seamstresses to take a few pieces in." Lucy and I were the same height, but she was much curvier than I was, especially since giving birth to the triplets. "Sounds perfect. Thank you so much, Lucy." Lucy winked at me. "Leave it to me. I'll go have a chat with the head seamstress now." Lucy headed off and I sat on the floor to play with the babies. Only yesterday I was lamenting never being able to leave. And now I was going to miss them while I was gone. After breakfast, I went back to my room where 3 seamstresses came by with a dozen pieces from Lucy for me to try on. They were all heavy and warm, and I was sweating by the time they were done. "We'll have these ready by the time you leave, Princess," one of the women said, before she hurried from the room. "Thank you," I called out to them, relieved beyond measure that Lucy cared enough to make sure I was comfortable and warm and still able to go on my dream visit. By the time we were ready to leave, Stavrock seemed to have gotten over whatever was bothering him earlier. He met me in the great hall with the easy smile that usually dominated his face these days, ever since he'd found Lucy. "I've sent word to Damon. We will fly to an outpost half a day's journey from the castle, then take the rest of the journey on foot." "Huh? Why not fly the whole way?" I tilted my head, my confusion only growing when his laughter boomed through the hall. Several servants turned their heads. His laugh always attracted attention. "It would be quicker, right?" I asked him. "I thought you would prefer to be properly dressed for our arrival, Cassie." Oh, right. Shifters didn't return to human form fully clothed. I pictured arriving in a strange land, in a strange throne room, naked in front of the fearsome, mysterious King of Winter. Heat spread across my cheeks. Stavrock's smile turned fond. "I thought I would spare my favourite cousin the embarrassment of appearing nude on your first meeting with Damon." Favourite and only cousin? Irritation prickled over my skin as I realised that he was still trying to protect me. I didn't want to be sheltered anymore. I wasn't the helpless, vulnerable little girl that everyone around here thought I was. I was 21 and officially an adult. Still, I couldn't deny the fact I was kind of relieved he'd thought of such a thing. I certainly hadn't. I didn't want Stavrock to know that, so I just glared and punched him on the arm. It rebounded off his solid frame and he ruffled my hair. "I've already sent your trunks ahead. The seamstresses worked for hours to alter the pieces for you. My men will be waiting for us at a checkpoint just beyond the mountains," he said. "I hope you're ready to stretch your wings." I grinned. My dragon itched to unleash. Absolutely. We walked through the main hall and stepped onto the balcony. Stavrock stripped off most of his clothes, leaving only his underwear for modesty. I almost laughed. He only did that for me. Everyone else in the castle had seen him naked 100 times. In fact, over the years I had seen him naked too, as he left and returned from his many flights, but I allowed him his moment of modesty right now. I followed his lead and stripped to my thin chemise and underwear, lamenting that I was wearing some of my favourite knickers. They'd be shredded soon. I really should have planned that better. I grabbed my cousin's hand, stepped up onto the balustrade next to him, and took a deep breath as I stared down at the town beneath us. Excitement whipped through my stomach in the same way the wind was messing with my hair. Crazy. Invigorating. "You ready?" Stavrock said. I nodded. I've been ready for this for years. He jumped, shifting mid-air and swooping low over the town. I let out a little excited squeal and, letting my shifter take hold of me, threw my human self into the wind. My dragon roared with excitement, rushing forward to take over. Taking to the skies again was like a dream. It had been so long since I'd flown further than the edge of town, and I glided over cloud banks and dipped low over the hilltops, spiralling through the air with the adrenaline of the shift and the freedom singing through my veins. Stavrock indulged my excitement, but eventually he steered me back on course. I followed him toward the mountains, and together we flew over the smoke-wreathed town in the foothills of the Black Castle. Eric and Marianne were somewhere below us, tending to their own kingdom. Part of me wanted to swoop down and say hello, but I was eager to push on. This was the furthest I'd ever flown from Stavrock's castle. The furthest I'd ever journeyed. Ever. I drank in the colours of the sky, enjoyed the wind rushing past my wings, and revelled in the sharp, icy chill of the air as we pushed onwards. Eventually, we started to spiral lower to land. I followed Stavrock until we touched down beside a small cabin in a sparse cluster of trees. A group of men rushed out to meet us, carrying thick robes. As I shifted, I found myself trembling the instant the cold touched my bare skin. As a dragon, the cold didn't touch me. As a human, it was very different. I'd never felt such cold temperatures before. I wrapped my arms around my bare breasts, my nipples pebbling into hard points from the frost. And we're not even in the far north yet. The man who passed me my robe averted his gaze out of respect, though I was sure the men had seen more than they should. I pulled on the robe, hugging the fabric tight around my body and trying not to show my embarrassment. It was hard to hide that, though, with my cheeks flushing with heat. No man had ever seen my naked body other than in this moment. And now that the day had finally come, a cold mountainside and a bunch of Stavrok's guards wasn't exactly the scenario I'd had in mind. Luckily, we were ushered into the cabin before the moment could get too awkward. Stavrok let out his trademark booming laugh. "Don't worry, Cass." He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder as he ducked through the doorway. "If any of my men fancy themselves a peak, I'll put their eyes out myself." I looked away in horror, only half sure he was joking. Stavrok could get like that, particularly with Lucy. I chalked it up to his protective nature, but it was more than that with me. I was a royal dragon shifter, and the men around me sensed the power that came with that title. No one would dare lay a finger on me, but I'd caught their eyes on me more and more often over the past few years, as my body had changed into one of a breeding-aged woman. Still chilled to the bone, I scuttled closer to the roaring fire, focusing on warming my face to cover how flustered I was. "I'm starving," Stavrok said, settling down beside me on the ground and stretching out his legs. As if on cue, a plate of hot soup and bread was presented to each of us by one of Stavrok's servants. My stomach lurched, and I put my hand to my belly. Damn, I was hungry too. Flying so far had really engaged my appetite. I ate with gusto, tearing into the bread and dipping it into the soup. "See," Stavrok said with a note of pride. "You're a little wild thing already." I made a face at him, but didn't slow down on eating. When the meal was over, we sat in comfortable silence and stared into the fire's glowing embers. "I have another surprise for you," Stavrok said. "Lucy and I took a trip to the seamstress last week. She had a hand in the design. Consider it an extra birthday present." He signalled to the man behind him, and the servant came forward carrying something over his arm. When he held it out for me, I gasped. "Stavrok!" He smiled as I held up the garment in the firelight. It was a long black coat lined with thick grey fur around the collar. The lining was soft and velvety, and when I slipped it on, it fit me like a glove. I ran my hands over the delicate patterns stitched into the material, a warmth tingling in my chest. Something brand new and made just for me. It was such a thoughtful, useful gift. "It's beautiful." I couldn't help rubbing my cheek over the soft collar. "And so warm." "Where we're going, dear one," Stavrok said in a soft voice. "You'll need it." I was silent, pretending to examine the coat as I mulled over my words. "Stavrok?" "Yes?" "What's he like? King Damon?" I bit my lip, regretting my pointed question. I would never admit it in 1,000 years, but a wave of nervous energy flooded through me every time I thought about the King of Winter. I was no stranger to meeting noble families and powerful men. But this felt different, and I wasn't quite sure why. It was my first time visiting his kingdom, and I wanted to know what to expect. What if I make a fool of myself? Stavrok gave me a strange look. "He inherited a broken kingdom, Cass. A king needs to be extremely strong to overcome such a tragedy." "But what's he like?" I pressed. "Tall? Short? Funny? Boring? I need details, Stavrok." Stavrok huffed, like I was being unreasonable. He trailed off, staring into the fireplace. "Tall. Are you satisfied, little one?" "Satisfied with tall? Hardly." "Don't call me little one." I rolled my eyes. "And don't avoid the question." "He's a king like any other," Stavrok said eventually. "We only met once and we were fighting a battle together. There wasn't much time for small talk, Cass." I released a long, drawn-out sigh. There was something he wasn't telling me, but Stavrok wasn't someone I could persuade information out of if he wasn't ready to share it. He'd tell me in his own time. Chapter 3. Cass. Our carriages were waiting for us when we passed the tree line, with all the belongings we would need for the trip. Given that I hadn't been given any information about how long the trip would be, I'd packed practically everything I owned, plus everything Lucy had altered for me before we left. I grimaced with sympathy at the thought of the servants lugging all that heavy baggage over the mountains. The men bowed low to Stavrock and me as we stepped up into the carriage. Once inside, I realized we were on a true royal mission, one royal family visiting another. And I was part of that. My heart started to hammer. The anticipation gnawed at me. This was it, the trip I had been waiting for. The journey of a lifetime. When I looked up, Stavrock was watching me again, a frown on his face. Annoyance flashed through me. "What?" I huffed, crossing my arms. "Are you ever going to tell me what's going on? You've been sulking about something since the morning of my birthday." He looked down, then stared out of the window at the landscape as we trundled on. I began to wonder if we'd spend the rest of the journey in silence. "I received word from Queen Marianne," he said at last. I brightened up at that. Marianne came to visit Lucy and I whenever she could. She was a natural with the kids, using her magic to make pretty floating lights for them. They loved her as much as we did. But she had her own kingdom to run and a new husband to boot. It had been weeks since I'd heard from her. "What's wrong?" My heart clenched. "Wait, is she okay?"
Yes. He waved a hand. She and Derek are fine. Better than fine. She had some news for me, is all.
He paused. The silence weighed heavily between us.
About you, he added.
I stilled. Marianne's visions were well known throughout the realm, but this was the first time my name had ever been thrown into the mix. I didn't know what to think. What news? I twisted my hands in my lap. Was it bad? Did she see something? She must have, or Stavrock would never have brought it up. His mouth pressed together in a thin line. Whatever he was about to tell me, I could see that it troubled him. My stomach tightened beneath my new coat. How bad could the news be?
She had a vision, he said. A vision of you. With King Damon. She believes that the two of you are connected.
He glanced out the window. I could tell he really didn't want to be having this conversation. I shook my head, totally lost. I couldn't see what the big deal was. We were going to the north to see King Damon, weren't we? If Marianne saw the future, her vision made sense. But Stavrock looked angry. "Is that what you've been so worked up about?" I snorted. "Some vision of me meeting the king? Hell, I could have predicted that, and I don't have the sight. We're heading there right now, remember?" Stavrock twisted around to look at me, his eyes hard.
"Cass, you don't understand. Marianne's visions, they don't happen every day. She wouldn't have foreseen this if it wasn't important. She believes that the two of you are fated for one another."
Shock flooded through me. That can't be true.
"I wanted to cancel this trip," I heard Stavrock say.
I wasn't fully listening anymore, just staring into space, processing the words, hearing them echo in my mind. Fated for one another.
"But I knew how disappointed you would be. Cass, I'm not saying Marianne is right."
"Has she ever been wrong?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Stavrock's face could have been carved from granite. His huge features, usually so warm, were deadly serious. He was more than my cousin. For the first time, I saw him for the man he truly was, a powerful dragon king.
"All I'm saying is that you need to be prepared."
Prepared for what? I wanted to call the carriage to a halt. I needed to ask a million questions. Truth be told, I was terrified. I knew about fated mates. I'd seen it play out right in front of me on the day Stavrock brought Lucy home to the castle. But it was rare for a dragon shifter to find their perfect match. Like, crazy rare. I'd never once imagined it might happen to me. To complicate matters further, I was a virgin. On the occasions I imagined the man I would marry, the idea was hazy and indistinct, but I'd always pictured something sweet, something romantic. Rose petals and soft music. Definitely not the crazed, lust-fueled pursuit that came to mind when I pictured a mate's heat. Something must have shown on my face, because Stavrock leaned forward. I looked up to meet his gaze. "Cass, listen to me. I won't let anything happen to you. I swear." He straightened up, his bulk spanning almost the width of the carriage. "I'm here as your guardian. I'll protect you, like I always have." Outside, the scenery was changing. The trees were gone. The landscape consisted of miles of frozen ground as far as the eye could see. Inside the carriage we remained warm, but I shivered all the same. "How much further?" I mumbled. I forced the whole conversation out of my mind. I had come here to explore, to see the world, and I was going to do that no matter what. Stavrock pointed at a distant tower poking over the horizon out of the carriage window. "We're almost there." As the carriage wheels turned and the horses picked up the pace, I barely heard the small talk from Stavrock. I couldn't hear anything beyond the rushing in my ears and my own thudding heart. It completely drowned out everything else. Why did it feel like I was about to meet my destiny head on? It was mid-afternoon by the time we arrived at the castle gates. The sky was pale grey, and snow blustered in through the door when Stavrock opened it. A blast of icy air hit me, and I turned up the collar of my coat as I stepped outside. My eyes widened as I took in the huge castle with its ancient drawbridge. A wide moat surrounded the fortress. Laid out around it was what looked like a giant building site. "King Daemon's enemies razed the whole town to the ground," Stavrock said, as we walked along a winding makeshift path. Everywhere I looked, townsfolk were hard at work, bricklaying, sawing, and heaving huge blocks of stone over the frozen ground. "They've been slow to rebuild. The conditions up here can be brutal." I craned my neck to watch the drawbridge as it lowered to let us over the moat. Everywhere I looked there were remnants of the battle, deep gouges in the stonework and burn marks over the battlements that could have only been caused by dragonfire. "It's so—" I trailed off, lost for words at the huge, imposing structure. Harsh was the word that finally came to mind. All the castles I had seen were square and smooth, made of sandstone. This castle was all dizzying turrets and spiky towers, edged with snowdrifts. "So tall," I said eventually, trying to remain polite and letting out a nervous laugh at my lame description. Stavrock grinned, leading me up to the huge front doors. The guardsman stepped aside, bowing low to let us pass. Back home, the palace guards were friendly and open with me. I knew all their names. After all, most of them had watched me grow up. These guards were different. They were fearsome in their thick overcoats, and the broadswords hanging by their sides looked like they had seen their fair share of use. The hallway was as grand and stately as I expected from the imposing exterior, and even Stavrock looked impressed. He glanced up at a huge window as we passed underneath an elaborate stone archway, whistling. "The last time I was here, this room was nothing but rubble," he said, catching my eye. I hardly even recognized the place. As Stavrock continued to admire the repair work, I trailed after him, my eyes wide. I tried to keep up, but in truth I was barely paying attention to the running commentary. Now that we were in the castle, it was impossible to forget about Marianne's vision. The man I was about to meet could very well be my intended mate. The one person who was designed for me, and me for him. Part of me wanted to run screaming from the place. The other part was so excited I could barely walk straight. I'd wanted a life and an adventure outside the safety of Stavrock's castle, and I'd gotten it. In spades. We were led deeper and deeper into the castle, down the cavernous hallways. Our guide, another stone-faced guard, made me nervous. I stuck close to Stavrock's side, my mind racing. My palms itched with anticipation, and my dragon shifter stirred closer to the surface than usual. I tried to imagine this king, a total stranger, somewhere in the castle. Could he feel my presence? Was this nervous anticipation just normal-level excitement at getting out and having an adventure, or was it more? What if what Marianne had foretold was true? I swallowed as Stavrock indicated I should move forward, and together we walked into a small antechamber. 2 more guards waited on either side of a set of huge doors. They stared at us impassively as we approached and knocked once on the double doors. My heart stalled in my chest. It was too late to turn back now. Chapter 4. Damon. "Sire!" The voice of my chief advisor echoing across the great hall startled me out of my thoughts. "They're here." I straightened and stood up from my throne, stepping down from the dais and striding forward into the centre of the large space. It was customary to greet a fellow king on equal ground. I could not meet my guests from up high on my throne. The formal clothes I wore were stiff and uncomfortable. I much preferred my everyday attire, but my advisers had cautioned against it for this meeting. I found all the court rules and regulations stifling, especially when my mind and my focus were on the repair work I'd been carrying out with my men only this morning. Still, Stavrock had shown me great generosity during the battle by coming to our aid. Not to mention what he'd done for us since we started repairing. It was only fitting that I return that favour by allowing him and his cousin to visit and see the renovations. Plus, it gave me a chance to show another kingdom that we were slowly regaining our former strength. Hopefully, the word would spread. My ancient house, the family of ice dragons that had ruled the north for generations, had survived the raiders. The castle wasn't the only thing my father had driven to ruin. I needed to rebuild alliances and treaties. The best way to do that was to make peace with my fellow rulers. The corners of my mouth lifted into a polite, welcoming smile as the double doors opened. His Majesty, King Stavrock of the Bravdock clan, and his cousin, the Princess Cassandra. Stavrock strode into the room with all the brazen confidence I remembered. The years since the battle hadn't changed him that much. Only a few more threads of silver in his hair indicated that time had passed. I greeted him with a nod, and he grinned back, charging over with his hand outstretched, ready to pull me into a friendly bear hug. He only managed to get halfway across to me, however, before I caught sight of the other newcomer standing behind him. My dragon instantly woke from its slumber, uncoiling inside my chest. I growled, trying to push him down. Something I'd never felt before pulsed through my veins, dark and hot, filling me with a single-minded purpose, a desire like I'd never known before. What the hell is this? Whatever it was, I had no power to stop it. The force rolled through me like a tidal wave. My vision began to change. Everything in the room faded out of focus. And nothing else mattered. Not Stavrock, nor my kingdom. Not my castle repairs. Not the fact that I was a king. Only she remained. Her chestnut-brown hair hung in loose curls, dusted with snowflakes from her journey. Her eyes were wide and fringed with dark lashes. Unlike most of the shifters I had met, who all had icy, pale blue eyes, hers were a deep, warm brown. I need her. The realization hit me like an anvil. I didn't have time to consider what it meant. I strode forward, my gaze zeroed in on my prize. Stavrock stepped in front of her, blocking my path. He knocked away my hands that were already outstretched for her. I released a deep snarl, prepared to shift fully if I needed to fight the other man. My neighbouring king. The obstacle in the path of my need. Stavrock was on the brink of shifting as well. I caught sight of his dragon when his angry gaze flashed to meet mine. Hot rage curled within me and I lowered my stance. Stavrock would not keep her from me. She wasn't any woman. This one was mine. On some level, where my brain still operated rationally, I knew the difference. I'd had women before. I was a dragon king, and I had to satisfy my appetite for pleasure alongside everything else. The stresses of recent years meant I'd tamped down my desires. In the face of all I had to rebuild, a fumble with a maid or some woman in town felt like a waste of time. I had responsibilities, more important things to deal with than my sex drive. Not that plenty of women hadn't put themselves in my path. I was their king. More often than not, I'd rebuffed them. And this was why. She was why. All thought of polite pleasantries and formal introductions were long gone. We circled each other, Stavrock managing to keep himself between me and the girl as I snarled with impatience. We weren't two kings anymore, meeting for an official royal visit. This was deeper, primal. We were dragon shifters, and the need to fight this invader, this intruder in my kingdom, coursed through me as strong as the ocean. For whatever reason, the mere sight of this girl inflamed my dragon like no other. Only one thing remained, the feral, frenzied, uncontrollable urge to take her and carry her out of here. Stavrock shouted something, but I was too far gone to hear it. I could only watch, burning with fury, as he grabbed the girl by the arm and practically dragged her out of the room. The moment the heavy doors thudded closed behind them, I was there, pounding against the wood. My shifter writhed in frustration. It was all I could do not to release my anger, shift, and burn down my own door to get to her. "Stavrock!" I bellowed, fists balled against the immovable oak door. "Open the door, right now, before I burn the damn thing down." "So, it is true," the voice came back, muffled, from the other side of the door. "Marianne was right." I was losing patience. As every minute passed, shifting looked like a more and more appealing plan. "What is true?" "You're my cousin's true match. Her fated mate," Stavrock yelled through the door. I forced myself to take deep, ragged breaths, fighting to regain control. It was easier now that the girl, Princess Cassandra, wasn't in the same room, but knowing exactly where she was, just out of reach, the feeling of it, the knowledge, it was pure torture. I groaned and again smashed my fist against the wood. "The two of you are destined for each other," Stavrock added. I pressed my forehead against the door, growling. "Then what are you waiting for? Let me through. You're not in control, Damon." I bared my teeth at him, even though he couldn't see it. Frustration pounded through me. "She's young," Stavrock hissed. "And still a virgin." "Stavrock!" Another voice cut in. A sweet, light voice, admonishing him for revealing a truth that had my dragon slowly retreating. A virgin? Then I would be her first. Her only. "Open the door, cousin," she said, and the sound washed over me like silk. She sounded perfect, right down to that thrum of desire I heard in her tone. Oh yes, She had felt the lick of need too, it seemed. But I needed to get myself under control so I could meet her properly. I straightened, crowding as close as possible up against the door and hoping she would speak again. "Get yourself together," Stavrock said, as if he knew exactly how hard I was struggling. Perhaps he did. His wife Lucy was Stavrock's mate. Perhaps it had been like this for him. "I'm warning you, Damon. If you can't control your dragon, I will leave and I'll take Cass with me. You'll never see her again." He sounded dangerous, deadly. If I were fully in my right mind, I might have been afraid. Stavrock was a fearsome warrior. I had no doubt that if anything happened to his beloved cousin, he would have my head for it. Literally. I focused on breathing, clearing the fog that had spread through my senses. "Okay." I took a few steps back from the door. "I'm ready." Slowly, the doors opened. Stavrock stood with his arms crossed, half in front of Cassandra. She sidled out from around his body shield. Had my behavior terrified her? One glance told me otherwise, from the lust burning in her gaze to the way a light flush spread over her cheeks. I forced down a shiver and turned my attention back to Stavrock. "My apologies," I said through gritted teeth. "Your cousin caught me by surprise." Stavrock's face was stony, and I could tell he was holding back for Cass's sake. He nodded, straightening up, his posture remaining protective. My dragon simmered with rage at the show of strength. I knew better than to challenge him, though, because when it came to the safety of his cousin, Stavrock was indeed doing the right thing. Even if my dragon couldn't see it yet. You could have cut the tension in the room with a blade. One wrong move, and the peace I'd built, this fragile alliance I wanted to strengthen between my kingdom and Stavrock's, could be reduced to ashes. We stood in silence, my head buzzing. "Well," Stavrock said loudly, clapping his hands together. "Do we get the grand tour?" "Of course," I replied, grateful for the suggestion. It would give us all something to concentrate on, other than my need to shift and fly away with my mate. "Follow me." Chapter 5. Damon. I led them through the castle, focusing my mind on anything but the woman walking with Stavrock. I pointed out all the changes I'd made and moved as if in a trance. The voices around me were muffled, like I was underwater. After a while, Stavrock stepped out in front and led the way, talking loudly and asking question after question. He seemed keen to put as much space between me and his cousin as possible. Cass herself was an enigma. I could barely keep my eyes off her. She flitted through the hallways, her gaze wide and excited at every detail, every new discovery. Occasionally she stole a glance at me, and I looked away the moment our eyes met, glaring down at the floor. I didn't trust my dragon not to grab her if he had half the chance. Her long dark hair tumbled around her shoulders in loose curls, and her eyes were warm and bright. Everything about her was a breath of fresh air in this cold, gloomy place. She reminded me of a butterfly, the way she darted from window to window. And yet, somehow, I knew that she was as aware of me as I was of her. Even though she seemed more able to throw it off and act normally, I sensed the desire simmering beneath the surface of her beautiful exterior. My dragon ached for her. More than anything, I wanted to grab her and haul her away somewhere, anywhere we could be alone. Then I could unleash all my passion and drive her into ecstasy. But a small part of me, the tiny shred of reason buried in the back of my mind, told me that Stavrock was right about not rushing this connection I felt for Cass. I couldn't risk offending Stavrock. And I couldn't risk her safety. Especially if she was as innocent and virginal as Stavrock said. Outside, The snowflakes tumbled thicker and faster as we reached the rear of the castle, where the high walls overlooked the small gardens below. Cass tapped on the windows. "What's that down there?" "The hedge maze," I said. Her eyes lit up at the prospect of an adventure. "My ancestors planted it centuries ago," I added, wanting to prolong the conversation with her, but still having trouble with my dragon staying under control. Stavrock's eyes narrowed. "Cass, you're not going out there in this weather. There's going to be a blizzard before long." Cass tilted her chin up at him defiantly. "It's my birthday, isn't it? We didn't come all this way so I could end up stuck inside another castle. No offense," she added, glancing at me. Heat gathered in my chest as her eyelashes swept across her cheeks. "None taken," I murmured, pretending intense interest in the weather beyond the window as Stavrock and Cass debated beside me. Eventually, Cass won the argument, and, as I turned to look at them, Stavrock scowled at me. I wasn't going to be the ally he hoped for. In this state, I could hardly deny her request. My dragon wanted to give Cass everything. I'll protect her. As we headed down to the small gatehouse at the foot of the castle, emerging into the frosty air on the long, winding path that took us toward the gardens, Cass appeared suddenly, bobbing up beside my elbow. I shuddered with longing as she brushed against my arm. The pink that rose in her cheeks had nothing to do with the cold air, and suggested she felt the same way as me. "What's in the middle?" she asked. I turned to stare at her, my eyes trailing downward. She was a petite little thing, only coming up to my shoulder. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I waited for her to clarify. "Of the maze," she added, and then bit her lip. I groaned internally, imagining what it would be like to sink my teeth into her soft flesh, right where her teeth currently nibbled. "Don't mazes usually have a prize in the middle?" Her gaze lingered on mine. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of prize she was imagining. There were plenty of places for two people to get lost inside a maze. Perhaps that's what she's counting on. I shrugged, not trusting my voice. She would see soon enough what was at the centre of the maze. Stavrock was glowering by the time we reached the entrance. The tall hedges on either side were already covered in a fine bank of snow. A glance up to the sky didn't tell me much. The weather could turn, or it could hold. Behind Stavrock, Cass was admiring a frost-tipped rose. The colour matched her glowing cheeks. She was utterly bewitching. I would give her anything she wanted. The knowledge terrified me. I glowered, hoping that my fascination didn't show on my face. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Stavrock grumbled, flicking snow off the edge of his coat. Cass grinned up at him. He sighed, mumbling something about birthdays and annoying cousins, but followed her into the maze without a backward glance. I trailed after them. My dragon was still simmering inside me, barely contained. The urge to grab her thudded continuously in the back of my mind. If anything, it was growing stronger with each twist and turn of the maze. Cass led us deeper and deeper. Stavrock swore when he stumbled over an exposed tree root, grumbling to himself. The hedges closed around us. Cass practically ran around each bend in the hedgerows. It turned into a game of chase. My heart raced as I tracked her through the maze. My dragon was single-minded and greedy. It wanted her. She skipped ahead, throwing a cheeky smile back at me. I caught the edge of a skirt, a loose curl, before she slipped out of sight around the corner. I glanced behind me. Stavrock was nowhere to be seen. I was alone. There was nothing for it but to go on. The sky above was white with snowflakes, which were falling thicker and faster than ever. "Cass!" I shouted. "Stavrock!" I listened intently, but there was no answer, only the wind rustling through the leaves around me. I knew the maze better than most. When I was a child, I often played in it, or hid away where the servants couldn't find me when my father was on one of his temper-fueled rampages. But as I got closer to the middle, my worry grew. I could make it out of here, but Cass and Stavrock.
Get to Cass, my dragon growled. Find her. Protect her. Take her.
I rounded the corner and got my bearings, realizing I was close to the center. My heart rate picked up when I heard a voice behind me, high and sweet. "King Damon?" I turned. Cass stood in the middle of the path. She had her arms wrapped around her body, tucked into herself, and she was trembling as gust after gust of cold air buffeted the hedgerows around us and sent her hair tumbling and flying within a cascade of snowflakes. "This way," I said, not trusting myself to get too near her. I strode down the path, leading the way. Her footsteps trotted as she caught up with me. "We need to get out of here." Her voice trembled. The snowstorm was building, and it wouldn't be long before we were trapped in it. "Shouldn't we turn around?" She was right. We needed to get under cover, and fast. There wasn't time to get back to the entrance and make our way back to the castle. I swallowed thickly as I realized that we only had one option.
You wanted to know what was at the center of the maze.
I strode onwards. The path narrowed, and I knew what waited for us around the next corner.
Didn't you?
"Well, yes, but—" I turned and stared at her.
Trust me.
Our eyes met. Heat sparked through my veins. Her breathing grew ragged. The fur on her collar rose and fell with each exhale. She nodded. Together, we turned the final corner. We had reached the center of the maze. Without Stavrock. In the middle of the clearing stood the entrance to the stone grotto that led to the caves. I ushered Cass toward the entrance. The snow was falling so thickly that I could barely make out the stony entrance. As Cass hurried into the grotto, I ducked back outside to take a final look around for Stavrock. He was nowhere to be seen. Cursing the weather, I ran back into the cave after her.
"Cass!"
My voice echoed off the rocky walls. I climbed down the steps cut into the rock. The sound of soft footsteps shuffled up ahead. My heart pounded with adrenaline. We were alone. I should never have agreed to show them the maze. I knew the weather would get worse. They aren't from around here. They don't know how harsh our winters are. They're used to rolling hills and mild snowdrifts. I admonished myself, but it was too late to change anything now. I could only blame my misjudgment on my foggy head and the overpowering lust that I couldn't shake. It was more potent than anything I'd felt before, and my body wouldn't let me forget that the source of my misery was a scant few feet away from me. "Damon," Cass called again, nearer this time. I stepped into the cavern. Dim light flickered from a torch set into the stone wall, casting a golden glow over the stone. Cass had her back to me, staring into the pool that dominated the room, watching the steam rise from it and spiral upwards.
"It's a hot spring," I said,
coming over to stand beside her. From this close I could feel the warmth from her body.
"People swim here sometimes. It's said that the water has healing properties."
She glanced up at me. "Can I?" Once I realized what she was asking, I stiffened. We would be stuck here for some time until the storm lifted. She was cold and wanted to go in to warm up, and with her staring at me like that, I couldn't think of a good reason why not. The second I nodded, she began to unbutton her coat, sliding the fabric down and off her shoulders. A growl rose unbidden to my lips. I turned my back on her and strode over to the other side of the cave, facing the mouth of the tunnel. "Where are you going?" Her voice was light, teasing. She was taunting me.
"Nowhere,"
I forced out as I stared down at a wooden chest by the entrance to the cave. It held clean clothes and towels, if I remembered correctly, but I couldn't make myself reach down to open the lid. My body was wound far too tightly. A soft rustle reached my ears, the sound of fabric dropping to the floor. I clenched my hands into fists when the gentle sounds of lapping water reached me. Then I heard her body slide beneath the surface. I swallowed, squeezing my eyes closed. "It's so warm!" Her tone was startled, as though she couldn't believe that up here in the freezing mountains, beneath the arid earth, were warm springs. But I heard the sweet undercurrent of pleasure in her words and began to imagine how she'd look floating in the water. I forced myself to relax and draw deep, even breaths. The mere thought of her naked body sliding beneath the water was maddening. I could hear the gentle splash as she moved around, but I didn't dare look. "Aren't you joining me, my king?" Her tone was teasing, and her words even more so. That was the last straw. I rounded on her. "What game are you playing at?" She was in the middle of the pool, submerged up to her bare shoulders. Curly tendrils of her dark hair lay on the water's surface. She looked like a nymph, or a siren, come to lead me to my doom. "What do you mean?" She sounded shocked. Her eyes, however, raked up and down my body. I had only deigned to remove my outer coat, and I stood before her in my shirt and slacks. Strangely, I felt like I was the naked one. "You want me to swim with you? Alone, in this cave? With—" I gritted my teeth, waving a hand to indicate her bare form. "Your cousin." "My cousin," Cass interrupted, her eyes flashing with impatience, "is not here." Chapter 6. Damon. Cass stilled and then looked up at me again. There was a new fire in her eyes, burning even brighter than before. I hadn't realized that she must have been kneeling until slowly she stood up in the pool and revealed herself to me. Out of the water. Guilt hammered me, choking the life out of the afterglow that flowed through me. I was sated, satisfied, and utterly screwed. This beautiful, innocent girl, I'd taken her, without a second thought about her innocence. My dragon had overruled my better judgment, and I'd done the one thing I swore I would not do until my kingdom was repaired. I had claimed my mate. My kingdom still lay in ruins around me. I spent all my days and many of my nights rebuilding the castle and the land surrounding it, shoring up our defences in preparation for winter. My world was one of ice and fire. The land was harsh and hostile, and only harsh things grew here. My people were tough. They had to be, in order to weather anything that the North threw at them. Cass was slender, beautiful, and delicate. She was a hothouse flower, a rare creature in such a cold climate. Such beauty surely couldn't survive the ice world in which I lived. I swallowed as she climbed out of the water behind me. Droplets cascaded down her body, making her look even more ethereal and delicate. After everything was said and done, I was no better than my father. The man had terrorized this country for so long. He'd been selfish and weak. He'd taken without a second thought. And now I'd done exactly the same to Cass. "Damon?" I half-turned my head. Mercifully, she'd slipped on her dress. It clung to her damp body, and I looked away before my baser instincts could wreak further havoc. "The snow should have eased off by now," I said. "We need to return to the castle before nightfall, or your cousin might." I trailed off and we stared guiltily at each other. What would Stavrock do? That was the burning question. Okay. She sounded so despondent that I turned to look at her properly. A stab of remorse ran through me when I realized she was shivering. I strode over to the wooden chest near the entrance to the cave, rifling through it until I found a large, fluffy towel. Here. I returned to her, draping the towel around the exposed skin of her shoulders and wrapping it firmly around her. Use this as an extra layer. She gave me a wan smile, and I picked up her coat, helping her into it. What about you? Her eyes flicked over my soaking form, and I remembered abruptly that I had been almost fully clothed when I rushed into the water. At the sight of her naked body, all of my common sense had gone out the window. I couldn't help the sheepish smile that crept over my face. I played it cool, shrugging. I'm from the north. We're cold-blooded up here. Her eyes glimmered, and the corners of her mouth twitched. Is that so? Well, you could have fooled me. She glanced at the hot pool behind her, as if to remind me wordlessly of our heated encounter. Like I needed reminding. My face remained stoic, but my heart was still beating a mile a minute in my chest. I regretted the loss of control, regardless of the current sated feeling in my body. Whatever the dragon inside me wanted, my actions had been reckless. Who am I kidding? If my dragon had its way, we'd already be going for round 2. Come on, I said, changing the subject. Your cousin is probably worried sick. Without waiting for a response, I picked up my own coat from where it lay in a crumpled heap on the floor and haphazardly pulled it on. Then I strode toward the mouth of the cave. I needed to put some space between me and Cass. That was all I needed. Time to think, to clear my head. The cold air hit me and my wet clothes hard as we exited the cave, but the snow had thankfully eased off. The sooner we were out of this maze and back under the watchful gaze of Stavrock, the better. At least, for Cass. Chapter 7. Cass. The journey back through the maze to the castle, despite my best attempts at conversation, was mostly silent. Damon didn't hesitate in choosing the path out of the maze. He probably had the route memorized. With his longer legs, I had to almost jog to keep pace with him, but I didn't mind that. It helped take my mind off the cold. Occasionally, I felt his eyes on me, but he always dropped his gaze before I could get a read on him. There was worry in his expression, though, and his broad shoulders were stiff with tension. It didn't make sense. Back in the cave, he'd been passionate and intense. Everything I'd ever dreamed a lover could be. Things had been simple between us there, when it was just the two of us. I wanted him, and he wanted me. Now he was evasive. I tried to make the best of the heavy silence and use the time to organize my thoughts. Everything had happened so fast. The last few hours were a jumbled-up blur of sensations. It was hard not to let the excitement of the day overwhelm me. I felt like a totally different person to the girl who had woken up that morning. From the second I'd laid eyes on Damon, my dragon had responded, hungry for his touch. We'd gone from room to room, down every hallway and explored every inch of his castle. Nothing slaked the burning fire in my belly. It was all I could do not to launch myself at him and demand he drag me away somewhere to ravish me. Which was so out of character, I couldn't understand what had overtaken me. I'd thought the fresh air might help matters exploring the maze, but I had no such luck. I had been aching for him to take me. My only thought by then had been to lure him deeper, somewhere away from prying eyes. Somewhere away from my chaperone, Stavrock. I thought we'd both gotten what we wanted. But Damon's attitude now suggested otherwise. I guess I was wrong. The second we were back inside the castle, He muttered something about needing a change of clothes and hurried off into another room. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud. I lingered in the hallway. My hair was still dripping from melted snow and water from the heated spring pool. The soft sounds of water dripping against the tiles on the floor was the only noise in the empty space. The ecstasy I had experienced in the cave felt like a far-off dream. I'd stepped back into the cold, harsh light of day, and my happiness gave way to doubt. What does this mean? What will happen if he doesn't want me? Ice filled the pit of my stomach. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, turning every detail of our encounter over in my mind. Now that the initial frenzy of lust had been satisfied, I could look at things more objectively. Did I do something wrong? I thought back to the way Damon held me against him, his firm hands on my hips, his hot mouth on my neck. The way he thrust into me, claiming me. I bit my lip, the heat rising in my cheeks once again as lust twisted in my belly, making me ache for more. He had wanted me, that much had been clear. So why can he barely look at me now? Cass! I turned, relief flooding me at the familiar voice. I'd never been so happy to see my cousin. Stavrock! I rushed over to him. We lost you back there. Are you all right? Stavrock's eyes flickered on the word we, but he otherwise ignored my phrasing. He grunted, looking unhappy. The way back to the castle was easy enough from the air, he said. I shifted as soon as the weather turned. I looked for you, Cass, but I couldn't see you. I thought you must have returned to the castle, but... He tilted his head. I could see the cogs turning in his mind, and I fiddled with my fingers, twisting them around each other, uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. Damon found me. My eyes flickered over to a nearby tapestry. Stavrock's gaze burned a hole in the side of my face, but I ignored him. There were these underground caves and... I trailed off. My cheeks grew hot. I reached up and pressed a hand against one, trying to hide my face behind my still wet hair. I see, Stavrock said. After his earlier attitude, I expected him to explode with anger. In the back of my mind, I feared he would tear apart the castle, kill Damon, and carry me home with him. But he didn't sound enraged. Instead, he seemed resigned. I looked up. You're not mad at me? His gaze softened as he looked down at me. Cass, I could never be mad at you. I scrambled for a way to explain. 1,000 excuses for my behaviour fell into my head. The weather, the cave, the water. The way Damon looked at me, how good his hands had felt. Stavrock definitely wouldn't appreciate hearing all the details. But I had to make him understand. It just happened, I whispered. It's like Marianne said. Like you said. I think it was always going to happen. Stavrock huffed, but he nodded. His hands rested on my shoulders, and we stood together in the quiet. When I look at you, I still see that tiny girl who showed up at the castle gates one night, with nowhere else to go. In a familiar, comforting gesture, Stavrock tugged gently on a lock of my hair. You've always been more than a cousin to me, Cass. You're like my baby sister. It's hard for me to admit that you've grown up. I know, but I have. He gave a heavy sigh and stepped backwards. It seems that I owe Marianne once again. We smiled at each other. Then Stavrock's face turned serious. Cass, it's probably best if I head home. I only came to introduce you to Damon and to protect you from his dragon if it was needed. But you've proven you can handle him well enough on your own, and, well, I need to return. I have my own kingdom to run. A shiver of loss ran through me. All this time, Stavrock had been a necessary endurance. My chaperone, an annoying brother figure standing in the way of my destiny. The thought of him leaving left me cold. He was the one constant in this stark and forbidding place, my only reminder of home. He gave me a regretful smile.
You don't need me here, Cass.
I know, but... I bit my lip to stop from continuing. I sounded petulant. The truth was, I was afraid, alone in a frozen fortress with a mate who was a stranger to me.
That's only if you want to stay.
Stavrock lifted an eyebrow.
Or have I read you wrong? You can come home with me also if you'd like.
The idea of leaving now filled me with an even greater dread. King Damon was my destiny, my fate. I was sure of it. I couldn't leave him now. I looked straight at my cousin and smiled as confidently as I could. I want to stay. Stavrock nodded.
I knew you would. I'm so proud of the woman you've become, Cass. I know you'll do me proud as my royal representative here, and if you have any issues with the Winter King, you know you can always come home.
I grinned at him. In this weather?
He shrugged. You're a royal, Cass. Shift and fly home. We'll be there waiting with open arms, no matter what.
Tears filled my eyes as I embraced my cousin, my protector, my king. Thank you, Stavrock. He was right. I was a grown woman now. If I wanted a life of my own, I'd have to take the opportunity on offer and make it my own. Stavrock had taken his leave, and night had fallen in the castle. Damon did not reappear. Luckily, I was considered a valued royal guest, so I was not left to wander aimlessly or lament being alone. The servants showed me up the winding staircase to a cosy suite of rooms. I huddled gratefully beside a roaring fire in the grate, watching snow drift past the windows. The fur throws strewn all over the bed were thick and soft to the touch, and I tugged one over my shoulders while I sat and stared into the flames. It was quite obvious. Damon was avoiding me. I rang the bell that had been left for me and called for a maidservant. It was a matter of minutes before the door opened and a woman entered. She was a slip of a thing, scarcely older than I was, and she eyed me with poorly disguised anxiety. "Can I help you, Your Highness?" "King Damon." I stood, letting the fur blanket slide back onto my chair. "Where is he?" The maid looked even more nervous at my question. I softened my expression, hearing Stavrock's words echo around my head. "You're a stranger to them, remember? They're not used to outsiders. You'll have to win over their trust, little by little." I'm not sure, ma'am." We stared at each other. We both knew she was lying. In all likelihood, he slept in another part of the castle altogether. He had tucked me away in one of the guest bedrooms, probably as far from his chambers as he could. Out of sight, out of mind. "Very well," I said eventually, defeated. "For now." The maid bobbed a curtsy before she turned to leave. A thought struck me, and I put up a hand. "Wait." She turned back, her eyebrows drawing together. "Can I help you with anything else, Your Highness?" I bit my lip.
"Win over their trust."
"I only wanted to ask your name." "My name?" She sounded surprised. "It's Isla, ma'am." "Isla." I repeated the unfamiliar name, giving her a genuine smile. "Thank you for your help, Isla." Her brows rose and she almost smiled back before her nerves kicked in again. With one final curious glance at me, the maid was gone. I thought longingly of my maids at home. Of Maddie, who scolded me constantly over reading too much, leaving my clothes in a mess and failing to follow the formal etiquette of the royal houses, among other things, and she didn't suffer fools lightly. I re-wrapped myself in the blanket and burrowed down into its warmth, staring into the flames. I would give anything to see Maddie again, even if I would most likely receive a lecture on disappearing into hedge mazes with strange men. Hell, I even miss the babies. Coming here had turned my world upside down. Nothing was what I expected. I'd flown farther than I ever had before, lost my virginity, and found the man that Marianne claimed was my fated mate. A fated mate who can barely look at me since our encounter in that cave. And I have no idea why. I gave myself a mental shake. Damn it. I was the Princess Cassandra of the Kingdom of Bravdok, cousin to King Stavrok. I was a dragon shifter, and a powerful one at that. Nothing was going to dampen my spirits. Not even Damon and his strange mood. I wanted to be here. No matter how nervous I was, how alone I felt now that Stavrok was gone. Maybe winning over Damon was impossible. I could be fighting a losing battle, wanting love from a man who had none to give. Something told me not to give up hope. I'd wanted adventure, hadn't I? Well, now I was right in the middle of one. I stared at the carved dragons and wolves over the fireplace. In the flickering orange glow of firelight, they almost seemed alive, twisting and fighting with each other along the wooden panel. The broad reindeer antlers hanging over the mantelpiece cast long shadows against the back wall. Maybe I could belong here. The question was, how could I get Damon to see that? Chapter 8. Cass. I woke the next day bright and early, my mind made up. I sat bolt upright, smiling broadly to myself like a madwoman. I had a plan. Damon could be as stoic and silent as he wanted. I wasn't going to let it get to me. I would enjoy myself, just as I'd intended to before all this business of soulmates and the irresistible desire that came with it got in the way. He can like it or lump it. I don't care. I flung off the covers and towed on the fur-lined slippers that lay waiting for me by the fireplace. A glance out of the window told me that the snowfall was lighter today. Yes, I would get a chance to see the countryside I'd been aching to explore for years. My stomach tightened with anticipation as I thought about the day that lay ahead. A sharp knock at the door startled me. "Come in," I called out as I bounced over to the huge wardrobe. All my clothes were hung up neatly inside, waiting for me. "Your Highness?" The door creaked open, and I smiled over my shoulder in the general direction of Isla's voice. "I came to ask if you'd like me to bring you some breakfast." I waved her off. "I'll eat with Damon," I said happily, then did a double-take as her eyes widened. "What's wrong?" "The king usually doesn't like to be disturbed, ma'am. He takes his meals in his study." I wrinkled my nose. "Well, let's surprise him." Isla looked frightened by this prospect, but I grinned at her. "You know, Isla, I'm a visiting royal, and I think I deserve at least a little of the king's company. Don't you think?" Yes, I believe you do, ma'am." Isla gave me a tentative smile back, and I counted that as a small win. Cass won, Damon yet to score. I grabbed her elbow and steered her toward the open wardrobe. "Can you help me pick out some suitable clothing?" Isla glanced at the rows of garments, then back at me, seemingly at a total loss. "I suppose, yes." I grinned with triumph. Did that count as win number 2? Rifling through my dresses, I pulled out a simple blouse with a lacy, open neck. "This is one of my favourites. What do you think? Pair it with a long skirt?" "I think you'll freeze before you take a step outside," Isla muttered, before slapping a hand over her mouth. "I intended no disrespect, Your Highness. I only meant—" I snorted and pushed the offending garment back into place. "Don't apologise. I really need your advice." I ducked my head. "I'm not exactly used to travelling. In fact, it's kind of a first-time thing for me." "I've never been south," Isla admitted. Her voice was quiet but full of curiosity. She rubbed her fingers against the soft lining of a skirt. "All your clothes are so pretty. I've never seen fabrics like these before." I stared at the clothes and shrugged. Pretty, but useless for this weather up here in the north. The only exception was Lucy's clothing that had been altered for me, but I didn't see many of those hanging up. Perhaps they were still being transferred here. Isla frowned with concentration as she scanned through the rack holding my dresses. Eventually she made a noise of victory, pulling out a soft pair of trousers and a sweater. She handed me the items before stepping back and looking me up and down, assessing. "Wait here," she said, before turning tail and leaving me holding the garments and feeling more confused than ever. I held them up in front of the mirror and smiled. It was hardly my usual style, but maybe I could get used to it. The whole point of the trip was to try new things. I kind of liked the idea of trousers. It offered more freedom than a long and often cumbersome skirt. "Winter chic," I whispered to myself. My reflection smiled back at me in the long mirror. In spite of Damon's disappearance, this trip was turning out to be rather fun. Isla returned with a dust-covered box tucked under one arm. "I found these stored away in the old Queen's quarters," she said, handing over the box. I took it, puzzled. The old Queen? Was that Damon's mother? "They look about your size. You'll need them if you want to stand a chance on frozen ground." She stared pointedly at the soft shoes I'd worn yesterday. They hadn't survived the hedge maze. They lay abandoned, still drying out in front of the fireplace. The silk was crumpled and stained with mud. A flush heated my cheeks at the memory of yesterday. To distract myself, I brushed away the dust on the box and opened the lid, pulling the soft tissue paper away to reveal a sturdy pair of boots nestled within. I pulled them out one by one, then plopped down on the armchair and tugged them on over my nightclothes. I felt kind of ridiculous, but wouldn't risk insulting my newfound friend by waiting until later to try them on. Isla had to help with the laces, but pretty soon I had them figured out. The boots were calf-length, soft and supple. They fit me perfectly, and they were so comfortable. I turned this way and that in front of the mirror, unable to remember the last time I'd worn clothes built for practicality as well as beauty. It felt surprisingly good. "They suit you, Your Highness," Isla remarked. "Will you need any help with the rest?" I shook my head. "I can manage from here. Thank you, Isla." As she left the room, I grinned. So far, so good. I dressed and threw my hair back into a simple braid before hurrying out of the room. Retracing my steps from the day before turned out to be something of a challenge. After encountering several dead ends and having an embarrassing run-in with a couple of confused guards, I found myself lingering in the doorway of a huge, darkened chamber. The dining hall. I peered inside, frowning around at the gloomy space. All the curtains were pulled shut, and the tapestries hanging from the walls were faded and worn. Guess he doesn't throw many parties in here. I shut the door softly and crept back along the corridor. Unwilling to ask for help, I ended up following my instinct until I came to a standstill outside a room where light spilled out from underneath the closed doors. Bingo. I hesitated and then knocked. "Come in." Damon's voice travelled through the door. His tone was muffled, but he sounded weary, like he hadn't had much sleep. Now or never. I turned the handle and slipped over the threshold before I could talk myself out of it. Damon was sitting behind a huge, old desk. There was only candlelight filling the room with a soft light, and very little else in the room. There were none of the riches I'd come to expect from a kingdom's inner rooms, but apparently this king was like none other. I was beginning to understand that, even though I'd only been here a day or so. He looked up at the sound of the door closing behind me. His eyes widened before the blank, stoic mask resettled on his face. "Cassandra, He stood, straight-backed and formal. Okay, so this is how it's going to go. How can I help you? His tone was stiff and formal. The servant said you don't usually have breakfast. I bit my lip, noting the way his eyes tracked the motion of my teeth. So, I thought I'd come ask if you'd join me. He blinked as if shocked. There were shadows under his eyes and thin lines of tension at the corners of his mouth. I ached to know what weighed on him so heavily. He seemed at a loss for words. That's very thoughtful of you. Thank you. I shot him a smile, edging closer. I am a visiting royal, remember? For a moment, it seemed as if I'd won a smile from him. But then his lips resettled into their non-committal expression. I settled for sitting at the edge of his desk, toying at the loose papers strewn over the surface. What are you working on? I asked. Farming ledgers. It's all boring. Paperwork, mostly, he said, shuffling the papers away out of sight. I'm heading out to the tenant farms today. I need to see how much grain the kingdom will yield before next winter. As he spoke, his hands rested on the desk in front of him. They were rough, expressive hands, large and calloused with use. The hands of someone who built things, crafted things, who worked hard alongside his men. Not a spoilt, rich king. Those same hands had only yesterday pressed relentlessly into my soft flesh, touched me everywhere, greedy and possessive. I swallowed at the memory, looking away. I'd like to come with you if that's all right, I said. I'd like to see more of your kingdom and meet the people. Damon ran a hand through his hair, staring at me with a strange look in his eyes. Are you sure that's what you want? I nodded. Yes, very much so. But with respect, Your Majesty. You need to eat something first. Is that so? He murmured. The look in his eyes told me he had something else in mind. Another kind of hunger altogether. Our eyes met. After what felt like an eternity, my cheeks heated, and I ducked my head. To hide my glowing face, I turned and hurried over to the door, peeking out of it. The footman who waited on the other side looked at me with curiosity. His Majesty and I will take breakfast in here this morning, I said, trying to sound confident. Hell, everyone needs to eat, right? Even the king of the ice dragons. If the footman was surprised by the request, he didn't show it, merely nodding before turning away. I shut the door and ambled over to a nearby bookshelf. I felt Damon's eyes burning into my back, tracking my every move. I didn't turn around, shifting my focus instead to all the unfamiliar titles. I ran my fingers along the decorated spines, my heart pounding in my chest. Some of the books looked ancient. I burned with curiosity, forgetting myself for a second and sliding free a book with embellished silver wolves on the cover. I leafed through it. You like reading? The sound of his voice in the hushed room made me jump. Although he hadn't moved from his position on the other side of the desk, the low notes raised goosebumps on the back of my neck. The effect was the same as if he was pressed right up against me. I do, Your Majesty. I slanted a glance behind me, only to meet his intense gaze. He stared at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't figure out. I didn't have much else to do growing up. I said nothing of the loneliness that had carved a deep furrow into my upbringing. My life had been full of music and companionship, but also captivity. Other children were allowed to explore the fields and forests of our kingdom. They roamed free, flying and fighting and playing together from sunrise until sunset. They weren't afraid of roadside kidnappers, raiders, bandits who would gladly hold a young princess for ransom or sell her off to the highest bidder. Although I didn't say any of this out loud, something in Damon's eyes told me he understood the isolation that came with growing up in a royal house. I wondered what his own upbringing had been like. Stavrock had told me his father was a tyrant. Was that true?
Where did you get those?
I followed the line of his gaze down toward my borrowed boots. Oh, a maid found them for me. She said I'd need them if I wanted to go out into the fields today. A shadow crossed over Damon's face. I glanced down at the boots again, feeling awkward. These were likely his mother's boots, I remembered. I tilted my head. The look in his eyes threw me off. I can take them off if you want, sire.
No.
He rounded the desk and came to a stop halfway across the room with his arms outstretched. Before he could reach me, his arms fell to his sides. I ached for him to come nearer, but he didn't.
No, I was just...
He frowned. His gaze darted away from mine, settling somewhere on the far wall.
Those boots belong to my mother.
I'm so sorry, I whispered. I knew that from what the maid said, but I didn't realize it might upset you. I should have asked. Embarrassment sent me spiraling. What was he going to think of me, rifling through his family's possessions like that? He held up a hand.
Please, I won't hear you apologize. You're welcome to them.
He paused, staring down at the floor.
It's been a long time since I've seen them, that's all.
His tone was stiff, overly formal, but sincere. I nodded, still not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to ask him questions about his mother, his life growing up here, but now didn't seem to be the time. He still looked distracted. He glanced out the window and picked up a handful of papers, shuffling through them, but his eyes had glazed over.
Cassandra.
He was still frowning when he finally addressed me again.
Are you sure you want to go out into the fields today? Wouldn't you rather stay inside the castle or walk around the rose garden?
Inside? Trading one castle prison for another? No, thank you. I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. Damon strode over and opened it, and the sweet smell of breakfast drifted in. I smiled, grateful for the distraction. I slid past him and took the tray from the maid, thanking her, before setting it down on the desk between us. I picked up a piece of buttered toast and nibbled on it while I considered my answer. I knew what Damon was trying to do, palm me off on the castle and its grounds, confine me to ladylike pursuits, in the hope that I'd be content to wander around exploring every nook and cranny of this place. Stay inside, warm and safe. The thought was tempting, but I knew he had another reason for wanting me out of the way. He wants to put as much distance between us as possible. The thought lanced through my heart. I was determined not to give in to the pain of it. I wanted Damon to take me seriously, to prove to him that I could do this, whatever this turned out to be. Finally, I looked up at him, raising an eyebrow in challenge. I would not rather stay inside the castle, sire. So, when do we leave? Chapter 9. Cass. The wind howled around us, battering the open carriage as it bumped and trundled along over the barren fields. I pressed my face lower into the collar of my coat, trying not to shiver. Seemingly unbothered by the cold, Damon rode up ahead on horseback. He made an indistinct, lone figure against the horizon. Only the bare, skeletal trees marked the landscape. It was a far cry from the lush orchards and grassy meadows I was used to. When I confessed that I'd never ridden before, Damon had looked surprised, but he didn't pass comment on my lack of skill. I guessed it was just another weakness in his eyes, fitting in with his image of the pampered princess flitting around her tower in satin slippers. Which, in many ways, was actually the truth. I squinted at the farmstead up ahead as we approached. It was a simple building, with cosy-looking gables overhanging the wraparound porch. The farmer and his wife waited for us outside on the steps. Damon arrived first, and he dismounted, handing off the reins to his footman and striding up to the farmhouse. I was struck by the way he carried himself. Every line of his body spoke of an easy confidence, commanding, yet open and friendly. The couple bowed their heads to him, and the farmer struck up a conversation. From their tone of voice, it was clear that Damon knew them well. All told, it was hard to imagine that this was the same man I'd shared breakfast with. The one who looked at me like a spooked animal and shied away every time I got too close for comfort. One of Damon's men helped me down from the carriage. I nodded to him and picked my way over the uneven ground. A deep permafrost made the earth hard and unyielding, and I would have slipped without my borrowed footwear. The farmer's wife looked at me as I stepped up to join Damon, her eyes widening in astonishment. She sank into a low curtsy, and I smiled at her when she straightened up. Damon's eyes darted to mine before glancing away again. "Allow me to present the Princess Cassandra of the Bravdock clan," he said, as if reading from a script. "She is currently visiting our kingdom." I inclined my head at the couple, silently noting Damon's phrasing. Visiting. Well, if that's how you want to play it. "It's an honour, Your Highness," the farmer said. Like most of the men in the north, his weather-beaten, heavily lined face spoke of a harsh life. "How long will you be staying with us?" "As long as I'm welcome here." I smiled back at him. I felt Damon's eyes on me, but didn't look at him. "You see, I've wanted to visit these lands my whole life." "Well, you're certainly welcome here on our farm." The farmer's wife gave me another warm smile. Her tone was pleasant, but her eyes were burning with curiosity. "And, forgive me for saying so, my king, we're so used to you coming out here alone. It's good to see you with company for a change." I heard the implication in her words, the way she lingered on company, and ducked my head, a blush coming on. I could feel the couple still eyeing me curiously. Damon cleared his throat. "So, I was glad to receive your letters. I take it you've made progress cultivating the southern fields for livestock." "Oh, yes, sire." The farmer rocked back and forth on his heels before waving his hand. "Please, follow me." As the two men strode off over the field, Damon glanced back at me, just once, like he was checking I was okay. I nodded at him. He turned away, apparently satisfied, resuming his conversation with the farmer. The farmer's wife was watching me when I turned to look at her. There was a knowing twinkle in her eyes that only grew as her face lifted into a broad smile. "Would you like some tea, Your Highness?" I rubbed my hands together, attempting to chase away the chill, and nodded. She led the way inside, taking me to a comfortable kitchen with a view of the fields out back. It was rustic, simple, and not unlike the cabin Stavrock and I had stopped at on our journey here. A fire burned merrily in the grate, and a small copper kettle hung above it. I relaxed onto a window seat covered with a patchwork quilt. As the woman poured the tea, I traced my finger over the rich patterns, letting myself be comforted by the soft noises of her whistling and the crackle of the fire. There was so little about this land that I understood. Bravdock seemed like a lifetime away. I took the teacup from her before frowning. "I didn't catch your name." "It's Molly, ma'am." The woman settled in a sturdy armchair and eyed me like she was measuring me up for something. "So, you're to be our new queen." I blanched, almost spilling the tea all over myself. I set the cup down on the small table in front of me. "What?" "Oh, don't worry." Molly gave me a conspiratorial smile. "I saw the way the two of you looked at each other. I know how it goes. When it's meant to be, it's meant to be." I chewed over her words. She wasn't wrong. My dragon had recognized Damon's immediately. I remembered the way it uncoiled in my chest, reaching out to him from the moment we laid eyes on each other. My eyebrows drew together. I picked up my teacup again and looked down into the brew, like the answers I sought were in there somewhere. What if it's not that simple? I said. Maybe it was wrong to spill all my troubles onto the first person to take any interest, but I needed to talk to someone. Hell, I needed advice. Something about this woman told me I could trust her. What could be simpler? Molly cocked her head to the side. Like her husband, she had lines around her eyes, but her gaze was softer, friendlier. Those were laughter lines, I could tell. He cares for you. You care for him. Well, when she put it like that, it did sound simple. He doesn't even know me, I whispered. Needing something to do with my hands, I ran my fingers along the floral rim of the cup. But he will. Molly said it with such certainty, I half wondered if she, like Marianne, had the gift of sight in her. I sensed it wasn't polite to ask. I stared blindly out the window. Somewhere out there, Damon was pacing the fields, checking over his ancestral homelands, doing the job he had been born to do. I pressed a hand to the cup, half wishing I was out there with him. I turned back to Molly. You seem very certain about all this. I've lived a long life. She shrugged. And he is my king. Then you must know him, I said, leaning forward again to face her. Better than me, anyway. Tell me, why is he so withdrawn, moody, unreasonable, infuriating? Her mouth quirked with amusement. I flushed, feeling that uncomfortable sensation again. She can read me like a book. His Majesty had a difficult upbringing, she said carefully. In what way? You know of his father, of course. I nodded. Stavrock had told me about the old king, how he'd drained his people of money and driven his kingdom into debt. Stavrock and Eric had joined forces with Damon to put an end to the scavengers and raiders who wanted to pillage the north and settle old scores. Those raiders hadn't cared how many lives were lost, as long as the debt was paid in blood. The sins of Damon's father were legendary all over the realm. But what sort of father had the old king been to his son? Had Damon suffered at his father's hands? His mother died shortly after Damon's sister was born. Molly frowned into the distance, lost in memories. It drove the old king mad with grief. They say he was never the same afterwards. I thought of the look on Damon's face that morning when he'd spoken of his mother. Damon's father took his pain out on the whole kingdom. Molly's face darkened. Crops failed, cattle starved. All the while, he stood by and did nothing. Locked himself away in his castle, growing more paranoid by the day, and he locked away the young prince, too. Damon? Aye. People barely saw him until his father died and he became king. By then the castle was a wreck. There's so much darkness in that place. The woman clicked her tongue. Bad, bad memories. It's a wonder that King Damon has managed at all. I stared into space, processing everything she'd said. I tried not to let the shock I felt show on my face. Despite my overprotective upbringing, I couldn't deny that my life had been full of love. Music and laughter filled my memories when I thought of my childhood. I had a cousin who loved me, and a kingdom that welcomed me with open arms. It sounded like Damon hadn't been so lucky. More tea? She asked, holding the pot in her hand. No, but thank you. Molly smiled at me kindly. Try not to worry so much, my dear. You'll clear out the cobwebs of that old place. I just know it. By the time Damon and the farmer arrived at the door, stamping the snow off their boots, I was warmed through. I wandered over to stand by the king. As we turned to leave, Molly dropped into a low curtsy, her eyes twinkling with pleasure. You're welcome to drop by whenever you want to, Your Highness, she said, looking directly at me. I was hyper-aware of Damon's presence at my side. His body had brought the cold in with it. He smelled of fresh air and snow. Snowflakes littered his hair and the collar of his dark coat. I jumped at the shock of coldness as his fingers brushed against mine. Molly's smile grew. "Thank you," I told her, "for everything." I felt Damon's eyes on me as we walked back to the horses and the carriage. "What?" I quirked an eyebrow in his direction. "Nothing," he replied, a little too hastily. I raised both eyebrows, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "You're good at that," he said quietly. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to say more, then closed it again. Good at what? I wanted to challenge him, ask him why he was so surprised I could hold a conversation with a farming woman. What kind of girl did he take me for? But I didn't push him for anything more. I accepted the compliment for what it was. We came to a standstill by the men, who were holding the carriage horses by the bridles, waiting for me to climb up into the carriage. Both of us were lingering. I wasn't sure about Damon, but I didn't want to be separated just yet. I can only assume he felt the same way. "Come on." Damon closed his hand around the reins of his horse. He offered his other hand to me, and I took it, though I was confused. He tugged me closer, his large hand gentle around my own. "You ride with me." Before I could say anything in reply, his hands wrapped around my waist. I gasped at their firmness and the warmth I could feel even through the layers of outerwear. He boosted me into the air, and I swung my leg over the horse, clutching the mane and panting with shock. "Oh my!" It was very high up on this horse, and very, close to Damon's hard, strong body. His hand clenched around the horse's bridle, and the animal trembled, huffing a little as he climbed up behind me. Damon exhaled, the motion pressing his chest against my back. He leaned forward, and his breath tickled the side of my neck. I shivered and closed my eyes, knowing he couldn't see how I trembled with desire for him. He could likely feel it, though, against him. He clutched the reins, an arm on either side of my waist. Then he spoke into my ear, his voice rumbling straight through me. "Comfortable?" That's not exactly the word I would use. I nodded to his question. I didn't trust myself to turn around and give him a response with words. That would bring our faces dangerously close to one another. He shouted something to his men and clicked the reins. And then we were off. I swallowed the scream that rose as I clung to the saddle in front of me, the huge arms of Damon surrounding me on each side and his body behind. I had to trust that he could hold me in place, because I sure as heck didn't know how to stay atop a horse without assistance. We thundered over the countryside like the hounds of hell were on our tail. Initially, there was only terror in my heart, but as I relaxed, I began to enjoy the exhilaration of the cold against my face and the horse beneath me. The blood sang through my veins. Riding with Damon was almost like flying, that same exhilaration, except this time I wasn't in control. He was. His body crowded close to me. It was impossible to ignore every flex of his thighs behind my arse, every brush of his arms against my chest as he adjusted our course. I could barely pay attention to the world around me or what was going on outside of the feelings inside me. That need was building up again, the need to claim what was mine. But I knew that wasn't what he wanted. My mind and body screamed at each other, tortured by the mixed signals. I was powerless to do anything in my current position. I could only let Damon ride us to our destination. He grunted behind me, and his hand pressed against my belly, pulling me more firmly against his chest. I wanted to arch back into him until I realized that he was merely adjusting my position, making sure I didn't fall. By the time Damon slowed the horse to a trot, we were approaching a shallow slope that led down onto a rocky scree. Several wagons had pulled up at the side of the road around us, and there were people everywhere, hard at work digging and toiling in the earth. When the raiders came, they burned many homes to the ground, Damon said, speaking for the first time since we started this journey. My people needed raw materials to rebuild. Stone, mostly. A team of people manoeuvred a huge machine to the base of the slope. Damon slowed the horse to a standstill. He jumped off with ease and held out a hand for me. I climbed down more gingerly, running a shaky hand over the horse's mane. "Thank you," I whispered to the horse. "Sorry for being nervous of you before." Just before he turned away, I caught the edge of a smile on Damon's face, and my heart lifted as hope twisted within my chest. Chapter 10. Damon. My heart was still pounding heavily beneath my shirt as I approached my men. I regretted my foolish impulse to ride with Cass as soon as I felt her small frame settle in my arms. She'd been so distracting I'd struggled with the simple task of steering the horse in the right direction. The scent of her hair, the softness of her thighs pressed up against mine, it was all far too tantalizing. "Pull yourself together." The voice inside my head, cold and stoic, sounded remarkably like my father. He was probably right. I couldn't afford distractions, not today. Not any day. I let out a deep sigh and walked on. Cass trotted up alongside me as we drew closer to the stone quarry. "Can I walk down there and get a better look?" I shook my head, frowning at the very idea that she'd wander off exploring. "You need to keep close to me. For safety." Several of the men put down their tools as we approached, giving her a furtive once-over as they did so. My hackles rose as a possessive instinct pulsed through me. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to keep walking. I ached to take her far away from them. I wanted to shift and fly us both back to the castle, just to get her out of their sight. There, I would claim her all over again, leaving her gasping my name until she could barely remember her own. I am their king. Nobody will hurt her. Nobody will touch her. She is safe. The mantra did little to calm me down. My dragon was inflamed, and the men seemed to notice because they dropped their gazes, mumbling amongst themselves. I drew level with them. "Is it ready?" "Yes, sire." Jace, my well-built foreman, spoke up. "We're waiting for your go-ahead." I nodded. "Very well, then. Fire away." Cass looked up at me curiously as we strode toward the edge of the rocky slope. I bent closer, letting my mouth almost brush against her ear. The quarry is so noisy, she won't be able to hear me otherwise. It was a flimsy excuse at best. Luckily, if she noticed the way I wasn't breathing normally, she didn't say anything. "We drilled down into the side of the rock yesterday. Now we're packing it with explosives," I said. "It's the best way to break up the stone." As I drew away, a shiver ran through her slender frame. It was no wonder. A chill wind was buffeting us, and the sky once again threatened snow. "Are you cold?" I asked. Worry sharpened my tone. When I spoke again, I made sure my voice was softer. "Because I'll take you back to the castle if you want. You only have to say the word." Her eyes flashed up to mine. "No, I—" Before she could continue, a loud whistle broke through the air. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her into my body for protection. "Cover your ears. Quickly." She did so, just as a loud boom shook the ground beneath us. Rubble rained down everywhere. The men cheered, and I smiled proudly. Where there had been a huge shelf of rock, there was now a slope, leading to a stone-filled crevice. My men descended into the new quarry, carrying their tools with them and setting to work. "What now?" she asked, lowering her hands from where they'd been pressed against her ears. I scrambled down the slope after them. She followed me, surprisingly nimble, ignoring the hand that I held out for her. My mouth quirked at her stubbornness. Now we break up the larger pieces of rock for transport back to the town. We? Cass tilted her head as I shrugged off my coat and rolled up my shirt sleeves. Of course. I smiled. What sort of king doesn't get into the trenches and dig alongside his men? I'm their leader. I'm hardly going to stand on the sidelines while they do all the work. I watched her absorb my words. In that case, she said, jutting out her chin, neither am I. I could already see that there would be no arguing with her, and since I'd all but given her the lines to use against me, why would I bother fighting her? She at least wore pants, and my mother's boots provided protection for her feet. Very well, then. Let's get to work. For the next few hours we worked in the quarry, picking away at the fragments of rock that lay around us. I showed Cass how to look for the highest quality stone, and she soon began working alongside the men in the processing section, talking with them as if she'd been doing this for years. The now familiar bond between us insisted I keep a close eye on things. I didn't want her to think I was hovering, but I hated to leave her alone amongst all those men. In fact, I couldn't leave her alone, no matter how many times I tried to walk away. It didn't matter that I knew rationally she wasn't in danger. My dragon didn't give a damn. I mostly hung around in the background, trying and mostly failing to concentrate on the task at hand. Jace sidled up to me. The two of us worked well together, and I trusted him implicitly. He nodded toward the group. She's in her element out there. I couldn't help but agree. Watching Cass working with my people stoked a fire inside my chest. It was impossible to keep on task. I could have watched her all day, a small, bright butterfly, flitting around all those hardened men like she was born to it. If you don't mind me saying so, sire. Jace paused for a long time. He was usually a man of few words, but even so, this pause was longer than usual. I tilted my head, curious to see how he'd finish. It's good to see a smile on your face. Been a long time. I wasn't even aware I was smiling. Oh. Thank you, Jace, I managed, then turned back to look at the little princess I'd assumed would never fit in here. But watching her out here, it began to dawn on me that I may have misjudged her. Clearly, she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, literally. I'd given her the option of staying at the castle, cosy and warm by the fireside, and instead she was out here, working on the frozen tundra with me and my men. She turned her head, and my breath caught at the sight she made. A curly strand of hair pulled loose from her braid, floated in the wind and brushed along her cheek, unnoticed by her. She had a smudge of dirt on the tip of her nose that took everything in me not to race over there and wipe it off with my thumb tip. When she caught my eye, I realized I was staring, but she didn't seem to mind. She gave me a small smile, and I couldn't help but smile back, even though I was faintly embarrassed at being caught staring. I inclined my head, giving her a stiff nod, and tried to get back to work. At midday, when a weak sun shone above us in the pale grey sky, I called a halt to the work. Cass and I sat on a rocky outcrop, a little apart from the others, and passed pieces of a sourdough loaf between us in comfortable silence. I'm sure you're used to fancier fare, I mumbled, fingering a scrap of the coarse bread. I was used to this, but Cass had grown up surrounded by beauty and luxury. Through her eyes, I saw the northern way of life in a new light. We must look like barbarians to her. To my surprise, she only shrugged. I've always preferred bread and cheese to huge elaborate dinners. A dreamy expression crossed her face. Although, I do miss strawberries. I laughed. Good luck finding those up here. I put out my hand, catching a few drifting snowflakes in the palm of my hand. It was snowing lightly again. I can't recall the last time I ate a strawberry. Her answering laughter was a soothing melody to my ears. I couldn't help but lean in closer to her. My hand came out, unbidden, and I brushed off the snow that had settled on her shoulder. She swayed into my touch, seemingly unconscious of her body's movement. "Come on," I found myself saying. "I have to show you something." Chapter 11. Cass. This time I was expecting the horse ride, which made it a little bit easier to handle. But only a little. That was a skill that would clearly take a little time to master. My legs were still trembling by the time Damon dismounted. He didn't offer me a hand. Instead, he simply caught me around the waist and lifted me down off the horse. I swayed into him when he set me on the ground, and for a moment I forgot where we were. He felt so good against me, solid and warm. I wanted to lean into his strength and stay there forever. He seemed to need a moment to gather himself too, because he didn't move away very quickly. "So," I began, and as I spoke, I was surprised to hear the husky undertones in my voice. Was that what being in close proximity to Damon did to my vocal cords? "What did you want to show me?" Instead of answering, he merely took my hand. There was a tantalizing mystery in his eyes, and I couldn't help but be drawn in by it. We weren't on the open plains anymore. High rocks loomed above us, and a pale, watery sun shone in the sky above. "Come with me." He winked at me, apparently determined to remain mysterious. I rolled my eyes, but let him lead me down the narrow mountain track we were on. The air felt warmer here. We were probably sheltered from the harsh elements by the hills around us. Odd patches of greenery grew in amongst the rocky terrain. It was the first true sign of nature I'd seen since arriving in the north. The sight warmed my heart. "Damon!" I squeezed his hand, drawing his attention. "Where are we?" "You'll have to wait and see." I trotted along beside him, trying to match his long strides. Curiosity burned within me, mingling with the ache that had taken up residence in the pit of my stomach. I need him. So much. How does he not feel the same way? I was almost frightened by the strength of my feelings, despite knowing that they were due to the mating bond. I wondered if I'd always feel this burning pull, this desire that coloured every interaction with this man and made it impossible to stay away. It was my dragon who felt it most. But that desire, that need, had grown bigger now. It was more than just pure naked want. I'd never felt this way before. When his eyes met mine, my stomach swooped like I'd missed a step on a staircase. Maybe I should have asked Stavrock more questions. I dismissed the thought. There was no way I was talking to Stavrock about any of this. He'd already seen and deduced more than enough as it was. Damon stopped in the middle of the path. He bent his head, and I shivered as his mouth brushed the edge of my ear. Did he know the effect he had on me? "Do you trust me?" he whispered. The words took me back to our encounter in the maze. The first words we'd properly spoken to each other. A spark of heat had passed between us then, just as it did now. "Yes," I breathed. Sheer instinct spoke for me, but as soon as I said it, I realized it was true. He'll protect me. He won't let any harm come to me. My thoughts were exhilarating. He stepped behind me and his palms came up to cover my eyes. I could barely breathe as he guided me forward. I felt like I was on the edge of a precipice, about to fall. It was the best goddamn feeling in the world. Soon enough, we came to a standstill. His hands fell away, and I opened my eyes. I gasped at the sight that lay before me. We stood in the middle of a lush green valley. The rocks underfoot were carpeted in moss, and the hillside around us was scattered with flowers. I could hear running water nearby, and I soon spotted a mountain spring trickling down from the rock face. In the middle of such a barren, frozen land, it was like I'd fallen into a dream. I turned to Damon. The astonishment must have shown on my face, because he huffed out a pleased laugh. The stiffness in his shoulders was gone, and the colour had returned to his face. "What is this place?" I whispered. "A secret hideaway." His mouth flickered with amusement, but his eyes were soft. He put his hands in his pockets, surveying our surroundings. "I come here sometimes to get away from—" He trailed off, shrugging, but I caught his drift. To get away from the palace. From his father. From his responsibilities. His life. The crown obviously weighed heavily on him. This place was his solace, a temporary respite from the stresses of day-to-day life. "Who else knows about this place?" "Nobody," Damon murmured. "It's my place. And now yours, Cass." Oh, my. The thought that he'd led me here, allowed me into his private hideaway, overwhelmed me. To cover my rising blush, I turned away from him, drawn by the sound of the water. I sat down beside the small waterfall, feeling the heat of Damon's presence as he came up behind me. My skin tingled at his proximity, yearning for his touch. "You can drink from this stream," he said, leaning over me and dipping his fingers into the clear water. I watched, oddly transfixed by the motion. "The water comes directly from the mountain. It's totally pure." I scooped up a handful of water and held it to my lips. It tasted sweet and fresh, just as he said. "How does this place—" I cast around, searching for the right words. "How does this exist?" Damon sat back and ran a hand through his hair. He'd taken off his jacket, and my eyes were drawn to the flex of his forearms as he relaxed back onto his elbows. "I've thought about that a lot." He frowned. "I think the rock face must form a kind of natural shelter from the ice and snow. It protects these plants and gives them a chance at life. Outside this area, they would just wither away and die, like everything else that tries to grow in the cold." As he spoke, he plucked a stray daisy beside him and leaned over, threading it through the end of my braid. It was a sad thought that all this tranquil beauty would not exist, if not for the rock face protection. I ran a hand over the daisy, fiddling with it. "So it's only here because it's protected?" "I guess so. From the weather and the rest of the world. If everyone knew about this place, it would surely be trashed within a few weeks." I let my hand dangle in the edge of the stream. I watched the flow of water before something else occurred to me. "But I've seen fields. People farm in your kingdom, don't they?" Damon frowned. "Of course. But they farm the tough plants. Root vegetables. Things that can survive the frost, not delicate flowers like these. Our crops are hardly beautiful. They're just tough." "Maybe they're beautiful because they're tough." Damon didn't look convinced. "Maybe." It seemed like a pointless argument. Anyway, we weren't really talking about the vegetation anymore. I huffed out a sigh. Flopping onto my back, I tilted my head toward him. "You're quite stubborn, do you know that?" He snorted. "I'm stubborn." His playful tone emboldened me. "Yes." I reached out and wrapped my fingers around his forearm, tugging gently. I hope I'm playing this right. He came willingly, crawling up over me until his arms were either side of my head. "I can't fight this, Cass." His eyes burned into mine. "No matter what I do, I can't." "Then stop trying," I whispered. He lowered his head and pressed his lips against mine. I returned the kiss eagerly, wrapping a hand around the back of his neck to bring him even closer. gentle flow of water lulled my senses. Damon settled down beside me. He folded an arm over my chest and his breathing slowed. I felt so safe in his embrace. I reached out blindly, pressing my hand to his chest to feel the comforting thud of his heartbeat. My eyes fluttered closed, and I drifted off to sleep. Chapter 12. Damon. "Cass," I whispered. "Cass, it's time to go." She curled closer into me, mumbling something in her sleep I didn't catch. I smiled and kissed the top of her head, turning my face upwards to the darkening sky. It was late afternoon now. The days were long here, but the nights were even longer. Soon it would be dark, and we needed to return to the workers and the castle before it became impossible to navigate the path. "Cass," I said again, more firmly this time. Finally, her eyelashes fluttered, and her eyes fixed hazily on mine. "Come on, sleepyhead." We found our clothes, pulling them on. The temperature had dropped considerably since we'd arrived in the clearing, and I moved closer to her, turning up the collar of her coat to keep the chill away. Her fingers paused on the buttons of her coat. She reached out, one finger running down the chain that lay partly exposed under the neck of my shirt. "What's this?" I glanced down at her wandering fingers, enjoying the sensation on my skin, before stepping away. I tucked the chain away and buttoned up my coat properly. The metal seemed to burn my skin through the fabric, like a beacon. "Nothing important," I murmured. "Just a family heirloom." She seemed to accept this, although the tilt of her eyebrows told me she'd get the truth out of me sooner or later. Her expression was still questioning. "What changed your mind?" I was caught off guard by the sudden topic change. "About what?" She lifted her chin, putting her hands on her hips. "About me." I just stood there, racking my brain over what to say. She didn't seem bothered by my pause. She waited, both eyebrows raised. I'd been in a tailspin all day, determined to keep my distance, yet unable to resist her sweet allure. But it was more than that. She doesn't miss a trick, this one. That's for sure. "You did well today," I said eventually. "My people don't take kindly to outsiders. Today, at the farmhouse and at the quarry, you won them over with what seemed to be effortless ease. You're not what I expected." Cass shook her head, like I'd amused her in some way. "I'm used to talking to people who find my status intimidating. The guardsmen back home. The servants. I grew up in the palace, so I know non-royals probably find me hard to relate to. But I try my best to make everyone see me as a person, and if not, a distraction, right?" She shrugged. "Something to lighten the mood." I frowned. That wasn't the case at all. "That's not true." I came over to stand in front of her. I reached out and took her hands in mine, forcing her to meet my eye. "You want to know what I think? I think they saw a queen. A queen who cares about others." Cass looked up at me. Her eyes were shining, but her face was smooth and calm. I drew up her hand and kissed it. The gesture was overly formal, considering what we'd just done, but it felt right. I was giving her the respect that should have been afforded to her the first time we met. A princess's welcome. Before our shifters got in the way. They were gone for now, sated by the pleasure in which we'd just drowned ourselves. My dragon slept lazily inside my chest, content to have his mate close by. We stood there in the twilight. I leaned down to brush a loose strand of hair off her face. When I straightened up, she was still regarding me. Chin up, shoulders back. Anyone in the realm, down to the lowliest kitchen boy, would have been able to see the royal blood flowing through her in that moment. A sharp whistle from somewhere beyond the rocks caught my attention. We had been gone too long. My men had sent out a search party to look for us.
"Come on," I said.
She tucked herself easily into my side, and together we picked our way through the valley, emerging on the other side of the rocks. I strode over to untie my horse, but we didn't have time to get into the saddle. Lanterns bobbed through the dusk, casting long shadows over the rock face around them.
"Over here,"
I waved, and the lanterns drew closer.
"Sire."
Jace, who was leading the men, hurried forward, relief plain across his face.
"We thought the raiders had come."
A flicker of regret passed through me as I caught a couple of worried looks from others in the group. My people were fearful for good reason. The mountain dwellers that had ransacked our kingdom 2 years earlier were still out there somewhere. We had thinned their ranks, but that didn't mean they were gone for good. They were biding their time, likely hungry for revenge.
"No, nothing like that," I said. "Cass and I just wanted to explore."
Judging by the expression on Jace's face, I could tell that he knew exactly the kind of exploring I meant, but thankfully he didn't remark on it. He took my horse's bridle and led it toward the search party. They were all waiting in a huddle, their bulky shadows looming over the gravel terrain. After spending all afternoon with Cass, the contrast between her and my kinsman was even more pronounced. She stood at least half a foot below the shortest of them, but she greeted them like old friends, dragging me along with her. They were careful not to get too close to her, obviously fearing my dragon. We set off. The terrain was too unstable in parts to go on horseback, so we had to travel on foot. We climbed down the rocky slope in tandem. I barely thought about where I was putting my feet. I'd spent years walking over these rocks. Cass picked her way over the ground more carefully than me. I pointed out the sturdiest stones for her and guided her around the deadly black ice that lay in wait of unsuspecting travellers. Then Cass spotted Rob, the kind elderly man she had been working with earlier that day, and she was off like a rocket. Before I could stop her, she'd slithered halfway down the slope in front of us in order to catch up with him. I'd only taken my eyes off her for 1 second, just enough time for her to dart ahead of me, out of reach. A sharp cry echoed through the valley. Cass. My stomach plummeted sickeningly. I broke into a run and shouldered aside a couple of concerned bystanders before dropping onto my knees beside Cass. She was curled up against a rock, cradling her ankle in her hands. Gently I pried off her fingers and ran my hands over the skin, pulling away when she grimaced with pain. "It's just a sprain." She looked up at me. "Damon, come on. I'll be fine." Her words were soothing, but I could tell she was in pain. For some reason, she seemed more concerned with me than the injury. I turned her foot slightly to look at the side of her leg, and she winced. There was a rip in her pants, and red stained the thick material.
"Is that?"
I reached out and touched the wet patch and stared down at my hands. Cass's bright red blood coated my fingers. I swallowed hard, my dragon roaring inside my head. "One of the rocks just cut me a bit," she said. "I'm a shifter. I'll be fine. You know that." I couldn't concentrate on any of her words or the calm energy she was trying to push toward me. All around me, the noise of the men murmuring amongst themselves buzzed through my head, growing louder and louder. Nobody got too close, but they set my teeth on edge nonetheless. "Leave us," I barked. I had never spoken in anger like that before. I startled them, but I didn't care. My men obeyed, and we were alone. Only the wind whistling against the rocks around us broke the silence. I stroked my hands over Cass's hair until we were both calmer. Eventually, Cass looked up at me. "You shouldn't have done that." Her mouth turned down at the edges. "I'm okay, really."
"You're not okay. You're hurt."
A voice in the back of my mind pulsed like a drumbeat.
This is all my fault. I brought her out here into danger, and now look what's come of it.
My rational side insisted I was taking it too far. The injury wasn't bad, she just wasn't used to the terrain, but I didn't listen to it. In that moment, I wasn't King Damon. There was only the dragon inside me, snarling and helpless, confronted with its injured mate, and ready to lash out at any threat, real or imagined, that got too close. I helped her to sit up, but when I put my arms under her to carry her the rest of the way, her body stiffened against mine. I can walk just fine on my own. She glared up at me. You don't need to act like I'm going to break. I sat back on my heels, stung by the force of her words.
Cass, you're being unreasonable.
No. Her eyes flashed with anger. I'm not. You think I haven't noticed how you treat me? I ducked my head, but I wasn't about to back down now.
You can't walk on that ankle, I said, reasonably enough, I thought. You'll only injure it further.
I gazed down at her slender legs, sprawled out against the rocks. She was so beautiful, so perfect, so soft. She couldn't survive in this place. In that moment, my mind was made up. I would rather spend the rest of my life knowing that she was safe before I let anything happen to her, even if that meant I could never see her again. Ignoring my warnings, Cass struggled to her feet. She leaned on her side, obviously favouring her uninjured ankle, but I didn't dare touch her. She put her hands on her hips. Why can't you accept that I want to be here, Damon? That I want to stay? I threw out my hands.
Why would you want to spend the rest of your life somewhere like this?
Because you're here! Petite as she was, Cass had a way of making her presence felt, like no other woman I'd ever known. I took a step back, struck by the force of her words. I know how I feel, Damon. And I know how you feel. The bond between us.
I don't care about the bond. All I care about is keeping you safe.
I ran a hand over my face, suddenly exhausted.
And I can't do that by letting you shackle yourself to me.
What are you trying to say? Cass's face was inches from mine. Her eyes filled with tears.
That you should never have come here.
My voice echoed over the empty landscape, reverberating off the barren grey rocks.
This place will destroy you, just as it did my mother.
As soon as I said the words, I wanted to take them back. But it was too late. You're a coward, she whispered. Her eyes were still dewy with tears, but now they turned hard. Rejecting me. You're ready to give up. On me. On us. Even after what we've shared. I thought you were better than that. I felt the blood drain from my face. It's not like that, I wanted to say. I didn't know how to make her understand. I wasn't rejecting her.
Cass, I
reached out to her. She ducked out of reach, turning her back on me, and limped away. My dragon grumbled inside my chest, but I ignored it.
This is all your fault, Damon.
The air shimmered around Cass's form, and my heart almost stopped.
Cass! No!
It was too late. Cass shifted in front of me, and I saw her dragon for the first time. She was slender and smaller than shifters tended to be this far north. As her wings extended, they shimmered pale violet. She turned to look at me one last time, and with a flash of her jewel-like eyes, she launched herself into the sky. I could only stare in shock as she flew off into the distance. Each beat of her wings broke something inside my chest. She was flying away from me, leaving me, going home to where she'd be safe. Despair filled me as she climbed higher and higher, edging further toward the forest that lay at the foothills of the mountains. Then, out of nowhere, 2 dragons swooped out from the thick bank of cloud that wreathed the mountain top. No! I didn't recognize those dragons. They weren't my people. They dive-bombed Cass on either side, releasing twin jets of ice over her as she twisted and thrashed her wings in an attempt to get away from them. My dragon roared up inside me, and I began to shift, keeping my eyes on the sky above. Hang on, Cass. I'm coming. It was no use. The ambush was short and swift. I was only halfway shifted when Cass's now frozen wings collapsed around her, and she dropped out of the sky like a stone. Chapter 13. Cass. I hit the earth with a thud that would have broken every bone in my body if I hadn't been in my dragon form. Staring helplessly up at the thick canopy of leaves above me, I could only lie there, winded, as my shifter curled up inside my chest. Damn it. I couldn't sustain my dragon. Soon enough I was human again, naked and shivering in the freezing cold of the north. I curled onto my side and crossed my arms over my chest, closing my eyes and trying to draw in breaths. If I fall asleep, maybe I'll wake up, and this will all have been a dream. With a groan, I opened my eyes again. I couldn't fall asleep, not now. But moving hurt. It hurt a whole damn lot. My attackers had damaged my wings somehow. Frozen them, maybe. And the pain of the fall stung through my body, especially my arms and each side of my ribs. They ached, like I'd been repeatedly punched. Before I could consider my next move, the undergrowth rustled and sharp voices pierced through. Saw her fall down here somewhere. We can't return without the girl. My heartbeat picked up as I realized they were talking about me. I squealed as something hot and wet dragged along the side of my face. Terror filled me as I rolled over, only to come face to face with the jaws of a huge wolf. Here! She's over here! A man called out. Footsteps trampled over the ground toward me, and I was surrounded. Hands reached out for my naked body. I tried to bat them away, but they easily caught hold of my wrists. I was totally outnumbered. On all sides of me, tall men with long, shaggy furs loomed over me, holding leashes on the creatures that had haunted my nightmares since I was a little girl, giant wolves. I began to shake and tremble. Blessedly, a fur was thrown over my shoulders, partially covering me from the cold and the gazes of the men. I pulled the fur around me and my lip wobbled. What were they going to do to me? Scream all you want, the leader of the men told me with a broad grin. Nobody will hear you out here. That didn't stop me. I screamed all the way through the forest and beyond. Damon. One moment I was staring up at the sky, feet planted firmly on the ground, and the next I was soaring high over the clouds. I let out an earth-shattering roar of rage and despair as I climbed higher and higher, beating my wings against the howling wind. Cass. I could feel my mate slipping away from me, somewhere far below, in the forest at the edge of the horizon. In the distance, a pale shape rose above the trees. My heart skipped, and for a brief second, I thought she'd managed to fight off the attackers and was free. When a second dragon flew up to join the first, my hope vanished. It was them. The monsters who had taken her, hurt her. She was gone. Muscles straining, I pounded my wings through the air. The wind had turned. While Cass had sped through the air, I was forced to fight through a gathering storm. My rage urged me onwards, the anger that pumped through my body so strong I could have broken through any barrier. The gates of hell could have opened beneath me, and I wouldn't have batted an eye. Beneath the sheer fury of the dragon, my mind whirled with panic. What if she's dead? It was my fault. All my fault. I'd put her in harm's way. If she was dead, I couldn't live with myself. I couldn't live. Period. The ground passing beneath me flooded with greenery, and I wheeled in mid-air, realizing I'd reached the edge of the forest. I reared up, beating my wings against the sky and letting out a roar. An icy jet of blue fire shot out from my throat. Come and get me, you bastards! I caught a flicker of movement in the forest canopy, the edge of a wing sticking out of the trees below. I dove toward the branches like a hawk spotting a mouse. I caught the dragon in my talons, and we tumbled down to the earth together, crashing through branches and bushes. The dragon fell from my clutches and staggered away, but I knew I had injured him. Good. I wanted to kill the bastard for endangering Cass in that way. The forest was cool and dark. The density of the trees dimmed the light, and I stumbled backwards, struggling to get my bearings. I was still in dragon form and didn't intend to shift back until my mate was by my side once again. My anger and panic turned me clumsy, and my claws raked the ground trying to get a foothold as I tried to locate the other dragon in the shadows. I blinked in the unfamiliar greenish light, panting hard. This wasn't my terrain. I was used to the open tundra, frozen and unforgiving though it was. The trees above pressed down, trapping me in what felt like a cage. A sharp pain lanced across my back as the enemy shifter dropped down on me from above. I roared in fury and lashed out, blasting a patch of foliage nearby and reducing it to ice. My blast managed to catch the edge of the shifter's wing, stunning him long enough for me to roll over, shake him off, and send him flying. The sharp talons at the edges of my wings gave me an advantage, as did my size. Whoever this shifter was, I stood at least 2 feet taller. Not to mention my wingspan, which dwarfed his own. His scales, however, were a pale icy colour. Just like mine. Were we kin? I couldn't think about that. Not now. Cass was in danger. Nothing mattered beyond that. The fight was vicious and short. The red haze that swirled through my veins turned me merciless, cold-blooded. I lashed out, sharp talons tearing through scales, and before long my opponent lay dead at my feet. I stood over him, panting. The bushes trembled. A low, deadly growl sounded. I froze. Another dragon. This one was bigger, and, when he emerged, the undergrowth rustled on either side of him. Yellow eyes came forward, followed by huge paws, soundless and far more graceful than mine on the forest floor. Beside the dragon stood a wolf. Huge and powerful, its hackles were up, lips pulled back to expose its long white teeth. The wolf's unblinking gaze fixed on me, waiting for me to make my move. Another wolf appeared, then another. Before I knew it, the clearing was full of them. A circle of wolves. And I was in the centre. This was an ambush. The dragon's gaze flicked to the dead dragon at my feet. I lowered my head, muscles coiled with tension. Logically, I knew there were too many of them to fight. My dragon didn't care. Inside, I was roaring, screaming for my mate. And if my dragon couldn't get to her, well, then I'd have to destroy those who stood in my way. I lunged at the dragon, knocking him to the ground. We tussled in a vicious fight for our lives. There were sharp jabs against my hide as dozens of wolves piled on us. The air was thick with fur and blood and hide and teeth. We twisted over each other, and I snapped at every creature that came at me. The dragon took advantage of my distraction, snapping at my tail, raking sharp talons over my wings until I scorched the ground in icy fury. But any shifter, no matter how powerful, was no match for me. I was a dragon king. And I had a mission, to rescue my mate. I drew in a deep breath, threw back my head, and roared. The air filled with white ice flames. The blast knocked back every beast that climbed my flanks, carving a deep crevice through the trees and down into the very ground itself. By the time I was done obliterating the area, the second dragon shifter and many of the wolves were dead. Yet still more wolves kept coming. How many of the creatures were there? There was a long, low whistle through the trees. I staggered to my feet, bleeding, injured, and exhausted. If I stayed, I could die. More shifters would come. I could already hear them heading this way. This wasn't a battle I could win. Not today. And not on my own. I needed my people. I needed my army. Frustration clawed its way up my throat, and I considered throwing caution to the wind and pushing through my fear, slaughtering everyone in my path until I found Cass. But a small voice, a mere echo in the back of my mind, the part that was still human, said, "Damon, no. You're smarter than that. If you want to save Cass, then we need reinforcements." I hated that voice, but I couldn't argue with it. If I wanted any chance to get Cass back safe, I had to be smart. Cursing the name of every god I could think of, I launched up through the tree canopy and back into the sky. Cass. I huddled on the ground in some god-forsaken corner of a cell-type prison room, curled up beneath the furs they'd thrown into the room with me. At least I wasn't going to freeze to death. Small comfort. I stifled a sob against the crook of my arm. I was scared out of my mind. At least none of them had tried to hurt me. Not yet, anyway. I wish I'd never come here. I wish I was home. Somewhere warm, where everyone knows me, and no one would ever try to hurt me like this. I clenched my jaw, willing the faint dragon spark inside me, the shifter that was currently nothing but a shadow, to warm my chest. Pull yourself together. You are Princess Cassandra of Clan Bravdock, and you are better than this. You wanted adventure, didn't you? Well, things don't get much more adventurous than this. In all those books I'd read about the North, I tried to think what those explorers did when they were in a life-or-death situation. Found their resources, I muttered out loud. It wasn't much, but it was a direction at least, a momentary chance to make myself feel a little less powerless. I lifted my head and took stock of my surroundings, though I couldn't see much. There wasn't any light inside my prison cell, but through the gaps in the walls, the flickering torchlight gave me enough light to make out the dim interior of a hut. The walls were made of rough-hewn wood, and the floor was one step above dirt. Whoever my captors were, they weren't advanced. Or maybe they just don't plan on keeping me here for long. I pushed away the unhelpful thought and uncurled my legs, stretching out. They hadn't bothered to tie me up, which I took as another clue that they didn't expect me to be able to run away. I could try to shift, attack them, or fight my way out of here. But these men were ice dragons and had taken me out of the sky once already today. I didn't want to die, and since they didn't seem to want to kill me, at least right now, I would bide my time and save my strength in case I needed to fight my way out in the end. The door swung open and a shaft of orange light filtered through, startling me. I ducked as something was thrown at me, but when it landed on the floor with a soft thud, I realized what it was. A bundle of clothing. "Get dressed," someone ordered, just out of view. Then the person slammed the door, and I was alone again. I crawled toward the dark pile, fingers closing around the cloth. It was soft to the touch, but spun out of simple fibers. I didn't care. I would have worn a freshly stripped wolf pelt in that moment. My hands were stiff as I slipped on the tunic and pulled up the supple leggings. My final garment, a loosely knitted shrug, was wholly unfamiliar to me, but I slipped it on. Mercifully, the shivering began to ease as I warmed up, and in turn my mind grew clearer. I shuffled around the small cell, the blood pumping through my veins and reaching my arms and legs. Everything hurt from the cold, but thanks to my shifter blood, I was healthy and well. The small ankle injury I'd sustained before I left Damon and the few injuries from my fall had healed. They haven't tied me up, and they've given me clothes. What kind of raiders are these? A dark thought occurred to me. If I was being held for ransom, I'd be no use to them dead. I paced faster around the edge of my small enclosure, checking for weak spots on every inch of the walls. My cage was well built, and from the sounds on the other side of the door, I had guards. Finally, I found a gap in the wood big enough to peer through. I caught glimpses of a few people sitting around the fireside, talking amongst themselves. They weren't all men either. My heart clenched as 3 women carried children across to sit beside the flames. They looked sleepy, but relaxed and content. This was hardly the stuff of nightmares. My spying was rudely interrupted by the sound of the deadbolt sliding back from the door and light spilling through the gap. I whirled, my fists clenched. I'd never physically fought anyone in my life before, but I wasn't going to cower in the corner like they wanted me to. "What's going on?" I hissed. "Where the hell am I?" The man merely stared at me, blank-faced. "Your Highness," he said, "come with me." Chapter 14. Damon. By the time I found my way back to the castle, the sky had faded into a purplish hue and a canopy of stars glittered overhead. I had no time to stop and appreciate their beauty. The flight had calmed my mind and body, and as I landed, my mind was clear. My rescue plan had formed. All that remained was to set it in motion. I looked around me as I shifted, vaguely aware that I'd landed in the middle of the drawbridge. I was sure the townsfolk didn't appreciate the sudden sight of their naked king, but I didn't care. We had to move fast. A shiver ran up my spine. I had failed to protect Stavrok's beloved cousin. He'll have my head on a spike. If it came to that, I would deserve it. Hell, I'd support it. The realization flooded over me then and there. I loved Cass. I needed her by my side. And I was going to do whatever it took to bring her back to me. Jace strode up to me, his expression clouded with worry. He held out a robe and I dragged it over my shoulders, falling into step beside him as we entered the castle. "Gather the men," I instructed my commander, Eric, who snapped to attention at once. All around me, people whispered to each other, hushed and frantic. "There's no time to waste." "Sire." Jace put a broad hand on my shoulder. It was a familiar gesture, and one I appreciated. Right now, I needed people I could trust, not servants bowing before their king. "What happened?" "Cass, she—" The words lodged in my throat, and I swallowed hard, jaw tightening. The very mention of her name sent my shifter reeling. "They've taken her." Keeping my voice low, I told him about the dragon shifters I'd fought in the woods, plus the hordes of wolves trained like attack dogs to take down anything in their path. Jace's eyes darkened. Raiders. There it was. The word that had haunted our kingdom for years. The dark figures that still filled my people's nightmares, crowding their thoughts with smoke, death, and ruin. Yes. I bowed my head. Although we were speaking quietly, I glanced around, making sure no one could overhear us. "In the woods, by the mountains. I'm not sure how many, but there were too many for me to fight off on my own. Thought we'd wiped most of them out." Jace frowned, running a hand over his thick beard. "I guess scavengers find a way to survive. You sure we have the strength to face them, sire?" I stared at the ground, gathering the strength to say what needed to be said. In truth, I didn't know if we would survive this, but I wasn't going to stop until Cass was safe again. Eventually I lifted my head and looked him right in the eye. "We leave at sunset." Jace simply nodded. He trusted me. I wouldn't send my men into a fight they had no hope of winning. As I watched him walk away, I knew what I had to do. Cass. I had no option but to follow the guy who'd come into my hut. We bypassed the fire pit, circling around it and heading toward the largest hut in the small encampment. For whatever reason, they hadn't blindfolded me. Small faces peered at me as I passed, with people coming and going out of the thick forest around us. They were fetching firewood and mending things. The wolves were nowhere to be seen. My guard came to a standstill at the doorway of the hut. He gestured silently in the direction of the door. I hesitated, terrified to discover what was on the other side. The guard gave me a nudge. It wasn't a harsh one, but it told me I didn't have a choice in the matter. Reluctantly, I walked through the door. The hut was dim inside, although a small fire burned under a bubbling pot. 2 men sat on low seats just behind it. They stood when I came in, and the tiny hairs on the back of my neck rose up. "Where am I?" I asked, trying not to let fear bleed into my voice. Then I remembered something. The guard had called me Your Highness. I definitely wasn't some random girl to them. "You know who I am?" I crept forward. They regarded me impassively, still mostly in shadow. "Why have you done this?" "Princess Cassandra," the one on the left said. His voice was rough, as if not often put to use. It reminded me of wood smoke or the logs crackling over the fire pit. "Welcome to our camp." He moved a fraction closer. As his face caught the light, I froze with shock. His face was strikingly similar to the man who had just broken my heart. He had the same high cheekbones, the same piercing, ice-blue eyes. His face was broader, however, and his hair longer and wilder. He had a fair amount of stubble and a scar at the edge of his jaw. The scars on his bare arms told me he'd seen his share of combat. "Who are you?" I whispered. I wanted to remain afraid, but some part of me whispered that I wasn't in danger. My dragon settled, slumbering in my chest, unfazed by the unfolding action. "He's Dmitri," the man on the right said. He had a smoother voice, a deep, rich baritone, and when the flames fell across his face, he too bore a striking resemblance to Damon. "And I'm Lucian." "This is your camp?" "Yes." Dmitri crouched before the fire, drawing out a cup and filling it with something that smelled delicious. "Please, eat. You must be hungry." I was, but I took the cup from him without bringing it to my lips. I had no reason to trust these people. Not after what they had done. I pressed my lips together, considering the 2 of them. "You shot me out of the sky and then dragged me here and flung me into a prison room." Dmitri looked downcast. "We're deeply sorry. You have to understand, my brother and I wish you no harm, Princess." I wrinkled my nose and corrected them. "Just Cassandra." Dmitri nodded. Wordlessly, he swept out an arm, indicating a cushion by the fireside. I sank down onto it, curling my hands around my cup, letting the flames from the fire warm me. "We seek an audience with the new king." Lucian returned to his seat. Despite the fact that he was the speaker, he seemed less forthcoming than his brother, content to stare into the flames. "We needed a bargaining tool." "And I just happened to fall out of the sky," I said dryly, mouth twisting. "Quite literally." "Please." Dmitri glared at Lucian, who merely raised an eyebrow. The former leaned forward, catching my gaze. "Our people are desperate. Survival out here is perilous, to say the least." Lucian snorted, but didn't comment. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in my mind. "The raiders who burned and ransacked Damon's kingdom." I stared into the flames, frowning as if the answers lay there. "That wasn't you, was it?" "No." Dmitri pressed a hand against his forearm, thumb tracing over a white, raised scar. "We've run into them ourselves on many occasions. When they were defeated,
That's when word got back to us that the old king was dead."
Lucian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
"We've spent our lives in exile, along with our entire village."
Why? As our conversation progressed, the wild men of my imagination transformed, growing less and less fearsome the longer I looked at them. I began to see them as they truly were, two young men who were just as scared as I was.
"The old king didn't take kindly to reminders that he was less than a perfect husband, a perfect father."
Dmitri exchanged a grim look with his brother.
"We were living proof."
"You're his sons." As I said it, I knew it was true. I'd known it from the moment I saw them. Damon's brothers.
"Half-brothers," Lucian corrected. "But yes, we want to talk with King Damon."
Dmitri folded his hands together, looking at me intently.
"But we knew we had to be careful. Nobody here knows him, knows what kind of man he is. If he's anything like his father—"
"He isn't," I interjected. He cares about his people. He wants to rebuild his kingdom. That's his main priority." I could hardly think of Damon without ice flooding into my heart, but I wouldn't lie about him. He may have rejected me as his mate, but I could say that much for him. He only wanted to recover what his father had lost. Nothing mattered more to him than that. Not even me. Something of my anguish must have shown on my face. If the brothers noticed, they didn't say anything, much to my relief.
"We have no interest in challenging his rule."
Lucian turned to me.
"We just want to live in peace."
They both stared at me for a lengthy moment. I narrowed my eyes at them, and then turned my attention to the delicious broth in my cup. I took a big sip, savouring the flavour. Finally, I set down the cup and turned to face them fully. "You two," I stared between them, "are idiots." Their eyes widened in shock, but I wasn't done. "I've been blasted with dragon ice fire, dragged through the woods and held hostage. I am going to say my piece, and they're going to listen. You should have come and talked to him, like rational people. Damon is good. He won't turn you away or hurt you, or whatever it is you're so afraid of. He's a good man, and he needs good, strong men to help him rebuild the kingdom." I drew a shuddering breath. "And if you take me back with you, I can smooth over this huge misunderstanding, and we can all move on with our lives." I crossed my arms over my chest and glowered at them. Dmitri and Lucian gaped at me. I raised one eyebrow, and then the other crept up to join it.
"Got it," Dmitri said eventually.
I exhaled. "Good!" I kicked out my legs, stretching them before the fire. I was warmed through now and relaxed. Finally. "By the way, Damon won't take kindly to the whole kidnapping thing, so you might want to let me do the talking to start with." By the looks on their faces, it was clear they hadn't considered the ramifications of holding me hostage. I gave them a cheery smile. "Can I have some more broth now?" An hour later, we were ready to leave. Lucian disappeared outside to tell the others that the camp was on the move. Dmitri and I stayed by the fire, trading stories. He had never been south of the mountains, and he wanted to know everything about what it was like to grow up in green, peaceful valleys, where life wasn't a continuous struggle for survival. In return, he told me more about the Kingdom of the North.
"Damon's father was happy once."
He twirled the stick in his hand, which he had been using to poke at the fire, as he considered his words.
"His mother, she wasn't born here in the north. Did you know that?"
I shook my head. Curiosity burned in my chest.
"Damon's father saw her one day when he was visiting the southern kingdoms to sign a trade deal. He carried her off."
Dmitri glanced at me, and I nodded. I knew how these things typically went, after all. Stavrock was a prime example, except Lucy had been in a human village when he'd carried her off. She was adored by the people, and by the king. But when she died, it was whispered that the ice and snow killed her. She wasn't made for the north. She didn't belong here. His head dropped. Forgive me, Cassandra. I don't mean to suggest that you... It's okay, I was quick to reassure him. I know. Well, that definitely explains a lot about Damon's fears for my safety. Come on, Dmitri said eventually, clambering to his feet and offering a hand. We should be on the move shortly. We emerged from the tent. That was fast, I said, startled. The campsite had been completely dismantled. All that remained of the fire pit was a smouldering pile of ash. A huddle of caravans, laden with belongings, waited for us at the edge of the tree line. Dmitri gave a loose shrug. We're used to packing up in a hurry, I guess. A wolf prowled the edge of the forest, and fear trickled down my spine as a small girl rushed up to it and buried her hands deep in its thick pelt. The wolf lowered its head and let the girl pet it. It was strange to see such a large, ferocious beast act so gentle. Maybe I've misjudged this place. In more ways than one. Ready when you are, Cassandra, Lucian shouted. He held the reins of a sturdy-looking horse. Your carriage awaits. I smiled at him. The sky above us went dark. Several people screamed as they stared up into the clouds. I glanced upwards, and my eyes widened as I made out the shadow of wings, so vast they blocked out the sun. A jet of silver fire burst across the sky, and my heart almost stopped. No! I screamed, waving my hands frantically. For a heartbeat, I considered shifting, but by then it would be too late. I could only watch as Damon circled the clearing above us, like a giant killing machine. Chapter 15. Cass. Dmitri and Lucian rushed forward, and fresh panic gripped me as their dragons gleamed in their eyes. They were about to shift, and if they did, he'd kill them both. Stop! He wants me! I ran toward them, and they stopped in their tracks. He won't hurt you. He's just looking for me. I had no idea how true that was, but I had to believe Damon wouldn't attack an entire camp just to get to me. The sky lit up again with icy flames. Dmitri wheeled to face me. Are you sure about that? I closed my eyes, reaching out with every ounce of mental strength I had in me. My soul searched for its mate, up into the cloud bank above our heads. A flash of coldness ran through me, a fury unlike anything I'd felt before. Damon. It was his rage I felt. His anger. His terror. Damon! Damon, I'm here! I'm safe. Please! I let out a gasp, and my eyes opened. The huge dragon descended into the clearing, its clawed feet leaving deep gouge marks in the earth. He roared, and the deep, powerful sound shook the earth beneath our feet. Damon's dragon was huge, bigger than I could have imagined, with a wingspan that easily stretched across the whole camp. His hide was pale, shimmering silver in the dim light. His eyes were the same icy blue as they were in his human form. The spikes that covered his head were sharp and deadly. As he lowered his head, they reminded me of a crown. He was magnificent. I stepped forward, separating myself from the group. I spared a glance behind me and kept my voice quiet but firm as I instructed a woman nearby. Bring me a robe for the king. She hurried off. I turned and faced him. His eyes were already fixed on me. Even from this distance, I could see his huge chest rise and fall with barely suppressed fury. I'm here, I said. I'm unhurt, look. The woman scuttled up behind me, and I took the robe from her with a nod. I sensed the tension in the clearing. At any moment it could break. It's all up to me. All my life I'd been told what to do. By my courtiers or my own family. None of that mattered anymore. I wasn't about to hide from Damon and let him destroy these innocents in my name. I moved closer, positioning myself between the dragon and the frightened villagers. I knew that Damon wouldn't harm them if there was a chance that he'd hurt me in the process. As I got within range, he moved sharply, as if to grab me. I stepped back and glared at him, shaking my head. He huffed with annoyance and glowered at me, but lowered his head. I tilted up my chin at him, triumphant. I'm not going to be carried back to the castle like a sack of potatoes. I raised an eyebrow at him and watched the fire in his gaze flicker, smouldering into embers. A hazy mist built up as he shifted, and when it cleared, Damon stood in the middle of the clearing. Even unclothed, his human form was imposing. His gaze was fixed directly on me, but his sheer presence was enough to freeze everyone to the spot. I stepped forward with the robe held between my two hands. He looked at me, his burning gaze unreadable. Then he fell to his knees and bowed his head, to my shock, and likely the shock of everyone else in the clearing. I knew what I had to do. Gently, I lay the robe over his shoulders. It was a coronation of sorts. The movement felt ceremonial, regal. When he rose to his feet, he drew the robe around to cover himself and took my hand. "My king," I murmured. He bent and kissed my fingers. The gesture was formal, more for the benefit of those watching than anything else. Nevertheless, when his mouth brushed against my skin, a tremor ran through my body. He dropped my hand and his gaze moved past me, onto the crowd at the edge of the trees. "Who is in charge here?" "We are." Dimitri's voice rang out across the clearing. Lucian stood by his side, unspeaking and unsmiling. Tension was written into every muscle in their bodies. Damon narrowed his eyes, but the expression mingled with surprise, which morphed into open astonishment. He'd picked up on the likeness between the two men and himself. Good. That will hopefully make this easier. I gripped Damon's arm tight, and his gaze flicked down to meet mine. "Come on." I smiled up at him. "Let's go meet your brothers." "Brothers," he whispered, seemingly to himself. We moved together, crossing the ground at a slow, careful pace. Damon looked like he was in a dream. Finally, we drew level with them. "Your Majesty," I said, looping my arm through his so he didn't swing out at them. "Allow me to introduce Dimitri and Lucian." Damon regarded the two men, who both inclined their heads at him in an identical fashion. "Cass tells me we're brothers." Damon's voice was low and still held an edge of danger. "I'll admit that I can see it. That's the only reason I haven't reduced this entire clearing to ash." Lucian's lip curled, and Dimitri flashed him a glare of warning. "King Damon," Dimitri said. "Our mother was the daughter of our village's blacksmith. The old king sent us into exile after the queen's death, along with half the village, as you can see." As he spoke, Damon sidled closer to me, tucking me in against his side, shielding me. Internally, I sighed. Is stubbornness a genetic trait amongst these ice dragons? "Damon," I interjected, pulling away slightly. "They were never going to hurt me. They needed some way to get your attention, and I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." "My attention?" Damon's eyes flashed, although thankfully there was now no trace of the dragon behind his gaze. "Why?" "We wish to come back, Your Majesty," Lucian said. Although his face was as sombre as ever, his tone was sincere. "We were banished from the kingdom many years ago, but now that our father is dead,
We hoped you might let us return." "The old king threatened our lives," Dmitri added. "We had no idea what kind of man you were. We thought we needed leverage." "Then you got more than you bargained for," Damon said fiercely. "Cass is not a bargaining chip."
"Damon." I placed a soothing hand on his shoulder, and he relaxed beneath my touch. "They know. They only want to talk. That's all. Look at them. They want to be safe again. These people deserve protection. Your brothers deserve protection." Damon stared down at me. Then he took my face in his hands and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead.
"Of course," he murmured. "Thank you, Cass."
Our argument earlier felt like a distant dream. I tried to recall my anger, how furious I'd been, but seeing him like this now, I could feel only love. He had listened to me. Actually listened. Relief flooded Dmitri and Lucien's faces, and all those behind them began to relax and chatter amongst themselves in low, excited voices. I couldn't help but feel a spark of pride. Damon straightened up, looking over the entire gathering, although his gaze soon returned to his brothers.
"You are all welcome to return. The kingdom is your home, and its gates will always be open to you."
He lowered his voice, addressing Dmitri and Lucien directly.
"Come to live with us in the castle. For as long as you want. God knows we've got the space."
The use of the word "we" lifted my heart, but I couldn't question it right now. There was too much going on to worry about whether Damon meant what he said, or if I'd gotten the wrong end of the stick from him yet again. Damon. I waited until the last of the caravans trundled out of the clearing before turning to Cass. We stood in the middle of the empty space, surrounded by bare patches of earth where tents had been pitched only a short time ago. Cass refused to meet my gaze.
"Cass, please."
I reached out a hand and then pulled it back, uncertain.
"Allow me to explain myself."
She tucked her arms around her body, biting her lip. The dark fringe of her lashes hid her eyes from me. "What is there to explain?"
"When I first saw you,
Unable to help it, I rushed forward, but I didn't dare touch her yet.
You know how I felt. How we felt. It terrified me. I couldn't see anything beyond your youth, your inexperience. In my eyes, you were this delicate, beautiful woman who had stumbled into a harsh wilderness. I knew there was no way you could survive it. Just like my mother. And I had trapped you here. I hated myself for putting you in that position."
"Thanks," Cass said tonelessly. Her eyes were flat and dull, all traces of their usual spark snuffed out.
"I was wrong."
Cass looked up sharply. "What?" I drew a deep, shuddering breath and lay a hand on her shoulder.
"I was wrong, Cass. And you were right. I was so wrapped up in the past, my father's mistakes, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. When I watched you drop out of the sky," I broke off, shaking my head against the terror of that memory. "I've never been so afraid in my life. And I realized I can't keep focusing on the what-ifs anymore."
"What are you saying?" Cass whispered.
"I've been so caught up with wanting you gone."
I leaned forward, forcing her to meet my eye.
"I wanted what I thought was best for you, for us. I wasn't seeing you for who you are. You're brave, smart."
"Keep talking." The corners of her mouth curled upwards, and some of the light crept back into her eyes.
"You brought me to life, Cass."
There it was. The truth I had been running from all this time.
"I can't live without you. I know that now. I'd give up my kingdom, I'd give the whole world, just to keep you by my side."
"I'm stronger than you think," she said, as her hand came up and clutched mine, squeezing my fingers gently. Emboldened by the gesture, I reached up and brushed her hair off her face, running my fingers through her curls. I still want to stay, Damon. My heart swelled, and I pressed a kiss against her mouth. She returned it eagerly, and for a moment we stood there in the clearing, tangled up in each other. Then stay, I breathed, watching her cheeks flush. Stay, and be my queen. Is this a proposal? Despite everything that had passed between us, the nerves still crowded my stomach. It is. I bowed my head before falling to my knees and taking her small hands in mine. All that I have is yours. It's not all you're used to, I know. I looked up at her. She was gazing down at me, her expression soft. Maybe, Cass whispered. But it's all I need. I reached into my shirt and drew out my thin silver chain, fingering the ring on the end. Cass's eyes widened, and she watched in rapt focus as I undid the chain and held the ring up to the light. This belonged to my mother. I turned the ring over in my fingers, memories crowding my mind. My father gave it to her not long after they met. It was small, silver-wrought, and delicate. Roses crept along the band, entwined with thorns. It's beautiful, Cass said. I held it out to her. It's too small for me to wear, I said. So I kept it on a chain. Close to my heart. Ever since she... I swallowed, not being able to say the words. But from the look on her face, she caught my meaning. I want you to have it, Cass. She would want you to have it. Cass fiddled with the ring. Gently, I took it back from her and slid it onto her finger. It fit her perfectly. Roses and thorns. She chuckled to herself. Beauty and harshness. I straightened and stood up. As I drew my arms tightly around her waist, she leaned into my body. In this land, you'll have to get used to both, I'm afraid. Well then, I guess I'll need some warmer clothing, she said, and stood on her tiptoes, lifting her face. I tilted my head down and readily gave her the kiss she wordlessly asked for. As I knew I always would. Epilogue. Cass. A dish was set down in front of us by a servant, and I gasped as the cover was removed with a flourish. Beside me, Damon's eyes danced with amusement. "Strawberries!" I shouted, loud enough for several of the wedding guests' heads to swivel around. "You remembered!" Undeterred by the eyes on me, I reached forward and shoved a strawberry into my mouth, groaning as the sweetness burst across my tongue. Damon chuckled, watching me. He accepted the strawberry I pressed into his hand and raised an eyebrow as he bit into it, clearly surprised by the sweet taste. "Good, right?" I grinned. He nodded. He was humouring me to some degree, but I didn't care. I snuggled in against his side, humming with contentment. I turned my face up to him. "I can't believe you remembered what I said about strawberries." "Of course, my love." He trailed a finger over the back of my hand. I turned my palm up and let him lace our fingers together. "Anything for you." The hall was packed with well-wishers and admirers. It was hard to believe that a few short months ago this place was so dark and still. Now, the carved wooden panelling gleamed, and the high arched windows framed the snow drifting down outside. Granted, it was a little different to the celebrations I was used to. The decorations around the hall mixed the north and south together, symbolizing our union. Delicate sprigs of blossom and pink ribbons were dotted around the tables, and shiny glass icicles hung from the high ceiling, sparkling in the sunlight. It shouldn't work, but it did. I smiled, catching sight of the banner hanging on the far wall. Wolves and dragons interwoven together, and the whole thing entwined with a border of roses. Summer and winter. I wasn't stupid. I knew that life would never be the same again. that there would be challenges thrown our way. But I didn't care. Besides, who didn't have challenges? I'd chosen my destiny. Where others might see danger lurking around every corner of this land, I only saw adventure. Not to mention the man I love. Along the top table, we sat with our friends and fellow rulers. The smaller round tables filled the rest of the space in the great hall. I caught sight of Rob, who I'd learnt knew everything there was to know about the history of the kingdom. At another table sat Dmitri and Lucien. They had declined the offer to sit beside us, but seemed content enough to observe the proceedings, if slightly unnerved by the number of people at mine and Damon's wedding. I let my eyes wander, smiling every time I spotted a familiar face. More and more of them were familiar these days. The change in their king had won over most of the townsfolk, and every day it got easier to chat to them. They weren't really as cold and hard as people said. You just needed to get to know them. And I had all the time in the world for that. "It's time," Damon murmured, and I straightened up in excitement, squeezing his hand as he got up from the table. As his chair scraped backwards, I locked eyes with Marianne, who sat a couple of seats away. She waggled her fingers at me playfully. Damon headed across the floor, weaving his way through the tables, and as I watched him go, Marianne chuckled. "What?" Marianne raised her glass of tonic water with one hand and cradled her round belly with the other. "Nothing, nothing." A smug smile played around her mouth. "I'm pleased you found your happiness here, Cass." Eric leaned over and draped an arm over her shoulder. "My wife is the matchmaker of the various kingdoms." He smirked. "I think it's gone to her head." He sounded a little annoyed, but the way he looked at her said otherwise. Pride shone in his eyes. "Not at all." Marianne stuck out her tongue at him, and he laughed. "It's just nice to use my powers for something good for a change." Eric's eyes softened, and something unspoken passed between them. I turned my head away to give them their privacy, scanning the crowd for Damon. My husband. I still couldn't believe it. I was a married woman now, a queen. A broad hand fell on my shoulder, and I looked up to be confronted with the full force of Stavrok's broad, beaming smile. "Cass!" He hauled me up out of my seat. I wheezed as he pulled me into a bone-crushing hug. "Oof!" I pulled away from him a little, laughing. "Stavrok!" My cousin gazed down at me, misty-eyed. "I'm so proud of you, Cass." "Looks like I figured things out on my own, huh?" I tilted my head, unable to resist teasing him a little. "No rescues necessary." "Look at you." He glanced around at the bright hallway and the snowy landscape outside. "You're the Queen of Winter." I let out a chuckle. Lucy appeared at Stavrok's side, flushed and happy, her long fair hair braided up at the top of her head. It had been some months since I'd seen her, and I gasped at the bump under her dress. "He's all smiles now, isn't he?" She looped an easy arm around Stavrok's waist. "Be glad you didn't have to see me wrestle him into his tux this morning." "Lucy!" She let me pull her into a tight hug, giggling as I squealed and hopped up and down with excitement. "Oh my God! Why didn't you tell me you were expecting?" I drew back. I couldn't punch her in the shoulder, so I punched Stavrok instead, who glared and rubbed his arm. "Geez, Cass, you're lucky it's your wedding day." Lucy looked unconcerned with her husband's plight. Her eyes danced with happiness. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "Hang on." I glanced over at Marianne, who was deep in conversation with Eric, still cradling her own pregnant belly. "Did you do this on purpose?" Lucy just shrugged, but a smirk appeared at the corner of her mouth. "What? They'll all grow up together. It'll be so cute." Stavrock shot me a look that said, "Don't even ask." Not that I wanted to. The less I knew about their sex life, the better, given some of the things I'd had the misfortune to hear back when I lived with them. Luckily, Damon chose that moment to reappear out of the crowd, his 2 half-brothers in tow. They were both dressed in suits in honour of the day. They obviously felt as uncomfortable as Stavrock did in their fine garments, judging by the way they kept tugging at their collars. They looked good, strong and regal. A far cry from the rough-hewn shifter men I'd met in the woods all those weeks ago. Although Damon and his newfound brothers had warmed to each other considerably since their first meeting, Dmitri looked apprehensive, his pale eyes narrow and his brow furrowed. Lucian looked downright suspicious as they reached the foot of the table. "What is this?" Dmitri asked. "You'll see," Damon said with a wink. I grinned back at him. I'd been looking forward to this moment. "Marianne, would you mind?" I turned back to Dmitri. "Marianne has a very special gift. She's agreed to use it on the 2 of you. My wedding present." Marianne stepped up from the table. "To Cass and Damon." Dmitri still looked unsure. "That's very generous of you, Damon, but it's not necessary." Damon held up a hand. "After everything the 2 of you suffered at the hands of our father, I wanted to give you a gift. Something you'll treasure forever. It's the least I can do." As he slid back into his seat, I turned to him and gave him a big smile. "What?" "Nothing." My smile grew bigger. "I'm just happy." He let out a huff, but I could tell he was pleased. My head dropped into the crook of his neck, and his arm came up around my shoulder, his fingers tracing lazy patterns against the back of my neck. "Have I told you how gorgeous you look right now?" he murmured. "Yes." I glanced up at him. "Many times, actually." Whatever his reply was, I found myself distracted by a sudden purple haze of light that erupted over the floor before us, flowing out from Marianne's outstretched hands. Several onlookers gasped, but the crowd wasn't fearful. Most of our guests knew Marianne and watched, fascinated, as the shimmering smoke continued to spiral outwards. Lucy had told me all about Marianne's courage, how she'd risked her life fighting in the battle. It was clear that she was a heroine in the eyes of these people. I was glad her powers were a source of admiration to them, rather than fear. With a deep, shuddering breath, she collapsed to her knees, utterly spent. In a flash, Eric was by her side, stroking a hand over her back. When she looked up, however, her eyes were wide with excitement. "I know where they are." As she spoke, her eyes wandered over to Lucy, of all people. "Where?" I asked. Why was she looking at Lucy? "Not here, that's for sure." Marianne got to her feet, still trembling a little. She was fast regaining her strength, stronger than she had been the last time we met. "They're beyond the portal, in the human realm." "Who are?" Dmitri asked. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Lucian said nothing, but he looked equally impatient to know the answer. Marianne blinked, like she'd forgotten about them altogether. She glanced at Damon. "You didn't tell them?" "Tell us what?" Dmitri demanded. "Damon asked me to find them for you, like I did for him and Cass. And Stavrock and Lucy. I used my magic to find the women you're fated to be with," Marianne said. Her shoulders rose and fell as she shrugged, and the sleeves of her elegant gown fluttered around her. Her eyes were wide. "They're in danger." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Marianne swayed against Eric, who put an arm around her waist and drew her into his side. She pressed a hand to her temple, like the memory pained her. "I saw an old house, a farmhouse, a pickup truck, and She looked up, her long dark hair falling over her face. She'd gone pale. A locked door. The women are together, but they're trapped.
Hold on a second, Lucian demanded. Are you saying our soulmates are human?
Yes, Marianne snapped. There's no time for the finer details. You have to hurry. Dmitri was already tugging loose his tie, unbuttoning his shirt like he was getting ready to shift then and there. The entire hall was hushed, agog. Dmitri and Lucian's gazes flicked back and forth between Marianne and the others like they were watching a tennis match. Lucian's hand shot out and he grabbed his brother's wrist.
Wait. Where exactly are these women?
Marianne strode forward. Instead of replying, she simply pressed 2 fingers against Lucian's forehead. His eyes slid shut, and when he opened them, his astonishment chased away the last remaining shreds of doubt and confusion.
"Thank you,"
he said, and she nodded, satisfied. Marianne turned toward the table, where the rest of us were still looking on in shock. I've just given them directions. They know how to get there. She paused, looking worried. In theory, anyway. Stavrok stood so fast that the silverware and glasses clattered over the table.
I'll go with them. They'll need a guide, someone who understands the human realm. And human women come to that.
He glanced down at Lucy, who patted him on the arm. My husband isn't the type to back down from a fight, Lucy added darkly. Promise me you'll come back in one piece. Stavrok bent to kiss the top of her head.
Always. You know I'd take you with me, but...
His gaze fell pointedly on her belly.
I won't be gone long, love.
He was already shrugging out of his jacket, the light of his dragon surging in his eyes. Damon sauntered up beside me. I took his hand in mine, and together we watched Stavrok stride out of the hall, Dmitri and Lucian hot on his heels. Well, that was exciting, I said. Damon's mouth quirked.
Did you expect anything else?
I laughed and shook my head. Soon it would be time to cut the cake, and after that there would be dancing, and the snow-covered grounds would be full of people, music and laughter. And after that? I fiddled with the silver ring around my finger, smiling. It had company now, my wedding band. There were many more adventures to come, and, with Damon at my side, I couldn't wait to get started.